I would like to call the Town Council meeting of December 5th, 2023 to order. And I'll ask our clerk to take the roll, please.
Councilmember Ennie?
Here.
Councilmember Moore?
Here.
Councilmember Hudes?
Here.
Vice Mayor Badami?
Here.
Mayor Rista?
Here. Thank you. The next part of our meeting is where we launch everything with the Pledge of Allegiance. And, well, all of our pledge leaders are special. But I'd like to call up Harrison Armour. Come on up here, Harrison. Harrison, this young man, I'm going to introduce you first, and then I'll give you the microphone, because you're ready to start, aren't you? Harrison is a third grader at Bagby Elementary. His favorite activities are Little League Baseball, math, reading, and then when I was talking to him, I found out he also loves playing soccer. And I get the feeling you have a lot of interests. And for his community service, he likes to help his classmates or teammates when they're hurt, unhappy, or confused. So thank you for making the world a kinder place. And I just want to note that Harrison is the proud son of, well, both of his parents are fantastic, but we all know Jennifer Armour, our planning manager, and one of her sons is here to do the pledge tonight. So with that, I'm going to give this to Harrison to direct us.
Please stand. Hats and hoodies off. Right hand over your heart. Ready, salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Done like a pro. All right, shake hands with Councilmember Hudes, and then come on back this way. You get to go back and forth. And then the mayor, I already shook your hand. Thank you so much. Like a pro. Vice Mayor, they did it before. And Councilmember Moore? All right. And thank you. You can tell he's practiced before, so let's give him another hand. My understanding is that he's done this at school as pledge leader, and it shows. All right. Let me just change mic. Sorry about that. Okay. So now that we've started the meeting off properly and energetically, I appreciate that. I'll just remind Harrison and his brother and his dad that you are free to stay for the entire meeting, or you may leave at any time if you've got animals to care for or homework to do or anything else, and nobody will take offense. So thank you for joining us as long as it works for you. With that, I am going to move to council matters. This is the part of the meeting where the council members share with each other and the public activities, meetings, what they've been up to since our last regular council meeting. So I will start with Councilmember Hudes.
Thank you. I guess starting just before Thanksgiving, I met with the Initiatives and Publicity Committee of Older Adults Thrive, and they have some terrific ideas for 2024. I met as part of the Council Policy Committee that day, and we considered, I think, one item. I met with Rob Stump about wildfire safety, and he has some new ideas, and I think we'll be coming to the council with some approaches for addressing the continuing investment we need to make in wildfire safety. And then, of course, like everyone else here, I participated in the winter celebration, the tree lighting, and the children's parade. It's the first time that I've participated since I've been on the council. I was getting a new knee last year, and I think the year before a new hip, and then before that we were in COVID. So I was delighted to be a part of it this year. It was really a pleasure. And that pretty much takes me to tonight. So that's pretty much what I've been up to.
Thank you. And with all those new parts, we'll be expecting you to be at all the future events,
Absolutely.
the Bionic Hue Days. Okay, with that, I'll turn to Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor. End of the month, a little slower on government items, a little heavier on home chores. I did meet the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Executive Committee, met since our last council meeting, attended the Finance Commission last night, and also the winter celebration items Mr. Hudis mentioned. And I met with my Finance Commission appointee to discuss Finance Commission ideas.
Thank you. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, everyone. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy Hanukkah. One of the things I really love about Los Gatos is how much it feels like the holidays when December rolls around. And so, like my colleagues, I attended the annual winter celebration and the children's and holiday Christmas parade. I won't repeat anything that they already said, but I was delighted to ride in the parade with three lovely women, Joe Greiner from St. Luke's, Sue Almadian from the St. Vincent de Paul Society at St. Mary's Church, and Marna Taylor from the Los Gatos United Methodist Church. And I chose these three women to ride along with me in the parade because they have, I think they really embody the giving holiday spirit. They help our homeless folks in Los Gatos more than really anyone I know, and they're truly loving and selfless people. So was really delighted they agreed to do that with me. I also want to give a huge thank you to the Los Gatos town staff who made both of those events possible. I keep joking about how amazing it is that we light up a big, beautiful tree and nothing ever goes wrong, knock on wood, but I just think that's really amazing. There's so much work that goes on behind the scenes, and from the Los Gatos Monte Sereno Police Department to Parks and Public Works to the town manager's office, it really does take a village. And so with it being all hands on deck, I hope everybody got to have a nice, relaxing weekend and relish in the fact that you all really helped make the holidays very special for a lot of people in Los Gatos. So thank you. I also want to thank the amazing organizations who worked with the town and who do so much to make the Christmas parade happen, which is LGS Rec, the Los Gatos Lions Club, and the Los Gatos Christmas Foundation, all really amazing. A few other quick items. I had the honor of delivering some closing remarks to SV at Home's Civic Leadership Program. SV at Home, for those who don't know, is they're a housing kind of think tank of sorts here in Silicon Valley, and they had a group of about 25 young people who were interested in public service. Three of the people who were participating in the program live in Los Gatos, and two of them are actually some of our town commissioners. And so they were learning about what it's like to serve in public office, how to participate in government, how to get involved on commissions and all kinds of things. And the big thing I told them is that being a young person in public service is not so bad, and that it's actually really an amazing thing to do. So hopefully getting some more young people inspired to get involved and help their communities. In closing, along with the mayor and town manager, I met with the faith leaders and Catherine Alexander from Supervisor Samidian's office. I'll let the mayor talk more about that if she wants to, but it was a great meeting. And we also met with staff from the governor's office, who really, I think, want to be a resource to the town of Los Gatos, which is really, really great. Great to have people in the state on our side. Councilmember Hudis and I met on the policy committee, and I also attended last night the first meeting of the Parks and Sustainability Commission. We've had the Parks Commission for a very long time, but last night was their first Parks and Sustainability Commission meeting since the council made that change. So all really exciting stuff. And then finally, I'm holding my council member community coffee this Friday at Purple Onion in downtown. I still have 2 slots open at 8 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. So feel free to shoot me an email to join me then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Council Member. I'll turn to Vice Mayor Badami.
Thank you, Mayor. As Council Liaison, I participated in the Community Health and Senior Services Commission. We received a presentation from Rockwell Pacific on proposed community benefit programs for seniors as part of an application for redevelopment of a proposed senior living community. The commission also recommended splitting county funds between support for case management and adult day services. On December 1st, I also attended the annual tree lighting ceremony at the town plaza. And on December 2nd, I participated in the holiday parade with grandkids in tow. On December 4th, I had an introductory meeting with the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce, along with Mayor Risto. And on December 4th, I also attended a meeting of the Finance Commission.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I think a lot of things were mentioned. I hope that everybody did have a wonderful Thanksgiving with family, friends, just a time to relax and take a breath before we hit all the whirl of the holidays, which we're in right now. On the 22nd, as mentioned, our town manager, Councilmember Moore, and I met with some representatives from Governor Newsom's office, primarily to talk about legislative issues, other issues of concern with the town, with them asking, how they can be of assistance or what things were important to us. So it's good to have that relationship started, and hopefully that will be useful to us in the future. On the 29th, the town manager and I attended my final for the year, West Valley Mayors and Managers meeting. So once a month, the mayors and the managers of the 5 West Valley cities meet for lunch. We set the agenda at the beginning of the year, and at this meeting, we mostly talked about legislative priorities for each of our towns and cities, as well as crime, what the perception was for the community, what type of crime was going on, and what types of things were effective, including flock cameras. And then the discussion was about the value of these meetings. So next January, it will be our next mayor. And so all 5 of the West Valley cities rotate mayors each year. So the mayors turn over, but the managers continue. And it's a really great way to collaborate with Monte Sereno, Campbell, Cupertino, and Saratoga, and just sort of work together on things. So it's been very valuable. On the 29th, as mentioned by Councilmember Moore, Manager Pravetti, our assistant manager, Nomura, and I met with a representative from Joe Simonian's office, county supervisor, as well as faith leaders from the 3 groups that are assisting with our unhoused residents, talking about what types of items could be part of the county budget and how we can get enhanced assistance on the work that's already being done. Of course, I think most of the town was at the winter celebration, tree lighting, and parade. And I think, to me, one of the remarkable things about the tree lighting, to get personal, is I moved here in August of 1987 and really thought Los Gatos was beautiful. I was working in Palo Alto, but of course spending, my weekend time at home here. And the tree lighting was kind of the first real inkling that I was like, oh my gosh, I live in an incredibly special place. And this past Friday was my 37th straight tree lighting. And I have to say, I fell in love with Los Gatos in 1987, and it just got deeper. With that and the parade, it's just a reminder of what an amazing community we have, what we have to celebrate, and how traditions continue even when new things happen. And as a part of that, at the tree lighting, former Mayor John Lochner was there. It was his 63rd tree lighting where he was leading the songs. And we also honored the Los Gatos Historics, I'm going to get it wrong now, the History Club. They planted, the women of the History Club, not the ones in there now, their predecessors, planted our tree 100 years ago this year. In 1923, that tree was planted, and we're still lighting it. So it was a really special evening. Last night, I was at the Finance Commission meeting. 2 council members serve as liaisons on there, and the annual comprehensive financial report was discussed, and that will be continued next Monday on the 11th of December. So if you missed that or if you're interested, we meet next Monday. And finally, I did attend policy committee meeting, and as the vice mayor indicated, met with the Chamber of Commerce. really great collaboration with the chamber, our economic vitality, and our town leaders. So anyway, with that, I will turn to our manager for manager matters.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I have several items for you tonight. First of all, tomorrow night, the council will be interviewing applicants for all of our boards and commissions, and the public is welcome to join us for that. On Thursday night, the 7th, at 6 p.m. across the way at the Adult Recreation Center, we're holding a community member meeting regarding the community garden and path. So interested citizens are welcome to that community meeting. We're going to have a study session with the full council on the same topic on December 19th at 5:45. So the council will also have an opportunity to provide input. On December 12th, we will be doing our mayoral transition. So this is a very special evening for us where we thank our outgoing mayor and welcome our incoming mayor. And again, the public is definitely welcome to celebrate with us that night. And then I'd like to give the council a brief update on the housing element as well as our public. On December 1st, we did receive the letter from the State Department of Housing and Community Development. It is posted online on our housing element website, and it has been distributed to all of you as part of a desk item for item number 11 on tonight's agenda. We are still evaluating the letter and determining appropriate responses. We are working with our housing element consultant and other outside advisors. We do have a meeting scheduled with HCD for next week, so we're hoping to get more clarity from the staff, we're hoping. And then finally, we are scheduling the housing element as a discussion item for the council at your next regular meeting on December 19th. The housing element consultant will be joining us, most likely via Zoom. So you'll have an opportunity to interact with her, get your questions answered, et cetera. So we are very much in process, and please stay tuned because it's a dynamic situation and we're learning as we go. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Manager. I see a hand. Councilmember Hudes.
Yeah, thank you. And we very much appreciate the work that's gone into the housing element and appreciate that there may be some disappointment in the most recent letter. And yet it does seem like we've made some progress. I've read the letter probably 4 times, and I wanted to get a sense about whether staff and the housing consultant could categorize the letter. The housing consultant, during the Planning Commission meeting on November 15th, said that there were 3 likely outcomes. A would be that if adopted as submitted, the housing element will comply with state law. B, the housing element could be certified with the addition of text specified by HCD. Or C, that the housing element will meet the statutory requirements of law once it's been revised and adopted to comply with items identified in the letter, essentially a rejection of the submission. Does the consultant believe that it's the outcome is C, and are there significant comments that require additional revisions?
I don't know if staff this item really isn't on the agenda this evening, so I'm not sure if it's appropriate for further discussion at this time, but thank you for the question.
I'll just echo that the item's not on the agenda, so the council can ask questions, but the council can't deliberate this topic. If you were to ask my opinion, I would say it probably fell into category C, but I'll say that pending, we're going to have further conversations with the town's consultant and with our HCD reviewer.
Yes.
So I have one follow-up. What is the plan to obtain certification of the housing element, and by when would it be accomplished?
That is the subject of the staff report for the 19th, so council will have that information for you for that meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think I can comment that everybody, including staff, is pretty disappointed by the letter. And I think the fact that it's a dynamic situation and it's still being evaluated, and staff will be meeting with HCD next week, hopefully we'll have more clarity on what is possible, what is probable, and how to move forward on the 19th. But I think it sounds, and I too, Councilmember Hughes, have read this letter over and over, and it's a little bit stunning. So I appreciate all the work staff is doing at the end of the year, and I look forward to really delving into this item on the 19th. So with that, we'll conclude manager matters. That moves us to the consent items. And right now on our consent calendar, we have 8 items. These are pretty straightforward items that are not expected to require a lot of discussion and can be passed with one motion. That said, members of the public always have the opportunity to speak on the consent calendar, any of the individual items, or all of them at once. I don't have any speaker cards. So do we have any hands on Zoom?
There are no hands raised on Zoom.
Okay, it looks like this is for the consent calendar. And if you have a card for later, bring it up, please. But nobody looks like they're coming forward to speak on the consent calendar. So with that, I will close the public comment and move to my fellow council members for any comments, questions, or a motion. Vice Mayor Badami.
See no hands up, I'll go ahead and approve the consent calendar, and that would be items 1 through 8.
Thank you. Councilmember Moore.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Not seeing any hands for discussion. I will call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. So consent calendar passes 5-0. All right, with that business taken care of, we now move to verbal communications. This is the part of the meeting where any member of the public on Zoom or in the room is allowed to come and speak before the council on any item that is not on the agenda. You'll be able to speak later on specific agenda items, and your time limit is 3 minutes. You cannot cede your time to someone else. And just please keep the topic on something that is before the purview of the town council, because it does relate to town business. So with that, let me see, I've got my only. Thank you. Okay, with that, I have 2 cards for verbal communications. Joseph Enns.
Ride program. There's 4 eligible homeless that are totally, and I'm trying to encourage them. They drop you an email on that. So thank you for that, for helping. Everything, they're doing a lot better. I'm doing better. You got to have a purpose. So I'll keep it real short. Thanks. The police are doing a great job.
Thank you. All right. Our next speaker is Lindley.
Good evening. I am speaking tonight just to let you know how happy I am that I'm an American and I've had the privilege of being able to speak to all of you this year. I knew it would be a great year, and I feel really happy that I've been able to express myself and not get arrested. And that we live in a land of freedom, and I hope that everyone recognizes that I'm not the enemy, and I know that no one here is the enemy. The enemy is not here at the moment, but we are, we're all on the same side. And with every time that I spoke, it was always with good intentions. It might have stung a little bit, but it really was with the idea of shining light on the darkness, because we're all in this together, and we really need to be united in love and talk to each other. And, you know, when you think that someone's your enemy, maybe it would be good to know them, get to know them, because they might know something you don't know. We're really all on the same side, and I love everyone in this town. And I love the Los Gatos Police Department because I know they've been defunded, and they're doing a great job. And they've been struggling, but they're doing a great job. And I just really hope that next year, and I know next year is going to be a great year, and I hope we can once again really come together with the same goals of freedom, not tyranny. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lee Quintana. And that's my last card in the room. So if anyone else in the room is going to speak on verbal, please get your card up, and then I'll turn to Zoom.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'd like to comment just a little bit on the letter that was received by HCD and your coming, or the staff's coming meeting with HCD next week. In my reading of that letter, and I read it at least 4 times, I think I can summarize that the main concerns are with the whether there's a complete analysis of the constraints to housing development, the evaluation of the past housing element, the adequacy of the AFH analysis, and before the site inventory can be adequately analyzed by them, those 3 items need to be addressed. My thought is that a lot of the notes that were sent to HCD for the submittal relied on justifying the town's position on things that were already in the element, or adding information, but not using it to further address the 3 analyses that are questionable. I would suggest that this time when staff meets with HCD, that they ask very directed questions as to what is lacking from the analysis, so that we can have a better understanding of what needs to be done to get it passed or accepted.
Thank you. All right, it looks like we've heard from everyone in the room who wanted to speak at verbal communication. Do we have anybody on Zoom?
There are no hands raised on Zoom.
Okay, so with that, I'm closing verbal communications, and we will move to other business, item 9, and it looks like our assistant town manager, who's been wearing multiple hats, will be up here for this item.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor and Council members. Katie Nomura, Assistant Town Manager and also Acting Human Resources Director. And so this item is because of Senate Bill 1436 requires an oral summary at a council meeting when a recommendation is made related to modifying the salary schedule, or fringe benefits of any person employed under an employment agreement with a local agency. And so our town manager is employed under an employment agreement. And as outlined, the town manager's performance and compensation is reviewed annually. Based on completion of the performance review, council recommended that the town manager's annual base salary increase 5% to $289,572 annually, retroactive to the anniversary date of September 2nd, 2023. And that concludes my report, and I'm here for any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any preliminary questions for our acting HR director? Okay, seeing none, I have no cards. I'll open public comment. I have no cards. Do we have any hands on Zoom?
We have 1 hand raised on Zoom.
Okay.
Mr. Veneta?
I just checking to see if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Great. Los Gatos, sorry for the hoarseness. I'm cold. I got a cold. Los Gatos has 8 huge housing projects as a result of our leadership failing to get the housing element certified. The general planning process started over 5 years ago in 2018. One very critical item in the general plan is the housing element. It is critical because the state gave the town a very adequate amount of time to get the housing element certified. It is critical because the state gave the town started off on the wrong foot by working first on the general plan that had no penalties and no deadline. That went well over their estimated time period, and no one in management thought they needed to move immediately to the housing element. The town received its first rejection letter of the housing element on January 12th of 23. Since then, the town has failed certification 4 additional times. It will be 2 to 3 months more before we have another shot at getting this across the goal line. In the meantime, more applications can be filed for non-conforming residential buildings. A disastrous consequence of the town's failure is something called the builder's remedy, long known by the town to have severe penalties. That's where we are now, 4 of which are building remedies on file with the town. More can be filed until the town becomes certified, but no other city we can find in our size range has more than 3 builder's remedies. What does that mean to you? By our calculations, the projects we currently have will create 1,141 market rate units, 247 affordable, 3,331 additional residents, and 2,000 more cars as the town continues to narrow streets like Blossom Hill and Los Gatos Boulevard. If you thought traffic was already bad, brace yourself. Not only will we suffer these consequences, but our greenhouse gases, aka pollution, which we are already far below our goal, will only worsen. What happens to the schools? What about water? Ask yourself why the town has refused to do a financial impact analysis. One of the new buildings will be 12 stories tall, 129 feet. That's more than twice the size of our current tallest building, the penthouse apartment, at 60 feet. 3 of them will be 7 stories, and we will lose the Los Gatos Ace Hardware on the north end of town, the post office on the south, and the Los Gatos Lodge in the middle. In my opinion, Los Gatos' top managers, consisting of Mayor Ristow and former Mayor Rennie, who both managed town manager Pravetti, have in the past 2 years caused the most disastrous situation this town has ever suffered. These 3 plus Councilmember Moore all approved of doubling the density of Los Gatos back in 2022. Does it occur to you there may be more going on than meets the eye?
Thank you.
The council will be voting tonight to give the town
I'm
manager
sorry, Mr.
raise
Veneta, your
15
time is up. And to be fair to everyone, I need to cut everyone off when they finish their first sentence after the time. So, do any council members have a question for the speaker? Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other hands on Zoom?
There are no other hands on Zoom.
Okay, thank you. With that, we will close the public comment and move to council discussion, questions, or motion. Councilmember Rennie.
I'll make a motion to approve an amendment to the employment agreement in attachment 1 between the town of Los Gatos and the town manager and authorize salary and benefit budget adjustment in the amount of $15,682 from available general fund capital special projects reserve.
Thank you. Councilmember Moore?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any comments or questions? All right, I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay, motion passes 4-1 with Councilmember Hudes voting no. So we'll close this item and move to item 10. Thank you.
Good evening again, Honorable Mayor and Council members. Katie Nomura, Assistant Town Manager. Similar report in regards to Senate Bill 1436 requires an oral summary due to these proposed changes to an employment agreement with the town, and the town attorney is under such an employment agreement, and that the performance and compensation is reviewed annually. Based upon completion of the performance review, council recommended that the town attorney's annual base salary increase 3% to $261,258 annually, retroactive to November 26, 2023. And that concludes my report. I'm here for any questions.
Thank you. Seeing no questions, I'll open this to public comment, and I have no cards for this item. Do we have any hands raised on Zoom?
There are no hands raised on Zoom.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll close public comment and look to questions or comments or a motion. Vice Mayor Badami.
I'll go ahead and make a motion to approve an amendment to the employment agreement in attachment 1 between the town of Los Gatos and the town attorney, and authorize salary and benefits budget adjustments in the amount of $5,897 from available general fund capital special projects reserve.
Thank you. Councilmember Hudes?
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion passes 5-0. And I just want to give a huge thank you to our town manager and our town attorney. There's a lot of work. It's hard. And I think the council appreciates your professionalism, your hard work, and thank you so much. All right. With that, we will move to public hearings, item 11, and our planning manager, Jennifer Armour, will have the report. Oh, okay, yes. So as we move to item 11, this item takes place or involves the post office site, and by state law, I am recused because I live too close to that location. So, let me see. I will hand everything over to the Vice Mayor, and I will be back for item 12.
So as we move on to agenda item 11 for the public, I will let them know this is consideration of the recommendation of the Planning Commission to introduce an ordinance applying the housing element overlay zone at 101 South Santa Cruz Ave, also known as the post office site. So I will look to Ms. Armour for a report.
Thank you, Vice Mayor, council members. Good evening. This item is an opportunity to consider applying the housing element overlay zone to a property at 101 South Santa Cruz. This is one of the sites that was previously included in the housing element sites inventory. This item came to council for consideration on November 7th, at which time the vote was to delay the rezoning of the property until additional feedback was received from the State Housing and Community Development Department, also referred to as HCD. The desk item distributed today includes the review letter that was received from HCD on Friday. The letter describes the need to promote housing mobility and increasing housing choices and affordability throughout town, which could be seen to support the inclusion of this site in the site's inventory and therefore its rezoning. However, when the site was included in the housing sites inventory, it listed a minimum capacity of 16 housing units that were all allocated towards fulfilling the above moderate income category, and none in the lower income categories. So the HCD comments are not understood to provide specific direction one way or another on whether or not this should be included as a site in the housing sites inventory. This concludes staff's presentation, but we look forward to supporting Town Council in this discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Armour. I'll look to my council members to see if they have any questions. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. So could you talk us through a little bit of how, if we don't implement the HEOZ, what that means for the zoning of the site moving forward?
Thank you for that question. So the zoning of the site right now is the downtown commercial zone, the C2. And so that is currently in place and will remain the same. At this time, the density that is applied if housing were a part of a redevelopment of the site, the limit would be a maximum of 20 dwelling units per acre. If the housing element overlay zone were applied, then that density would be changed to now be a range that would be a minimum of 20 dwelling units per acre, a maximum of 30. So that is the primary change that would be involved. There are some other changes to other zones influencing height, but in the downtown, we were already at a 45-foot height limit, and so that would not have changed under the housing element overlay.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from council members? Councilmember Hudes.
Thank you. I'm trying to evaluate this in the light of what our buffer is, and it's moved around a bit. And I believe in the latest submission it was 24% buffer. But there was something that caught my eye about ADUs. In the table, it shows 200 ADUs that are part of the plan. And on page 10-50, it states that our goal is 350 ADUs. I'm assuming that the 200 is what's in the current buffer, not the 350. And is there a reason that we're not considering 350?
Thank you for that question. The 200 accessory dwelling units has consistently been what was included in the housing element in terms of a projection for the 8 years. I can look up to see what the 350 is, but I know that the 200 has been consistently the projection included.
Well, the 350 is one of the new revisions that was put in place between October 2nd and November, which is why I was asking that question. Just trying to understand how much buffer we really have.
I'll have to get back to you on that question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I can move on to speakers while Ms. Armour looks that up. Okay. All right, so we have 2 speaker cards, and I'm going to open this up for public comment by calling Mike LaBarbera up to the microphone.
Hello. I'm Mike LaBarbera. I'm the current owner of the post office, and my family has owned this since August of '91, 32 years. Most of you may know I'm a real estate developer, and we've been waiting patiently for the last 32 years to try to bring a project to downtown that we thought was worthwhile of that spot. It's one of the most noteworthy spots in town, and right now it's taken by what's arguably the ugliest building in town. So we hope to bring a great project there. We've been waiting for the stars to align, and they seem to align. And last week we brought forth a project that we think is the right project and is a great project, and we hope that it will get approved, and we think it will. But I was looking at the agenda tonight, and despite our filing, I wanted to come and speak to what you're talking about, because as I was thinking about our project, I think the 2 most controversial things will be subjective. What does it look like, and how tall is it? And one of the things being talked about tonight is 45-foot height limit, which when we brought a project through 6 years ago, 45 wasn't even in question. I mean, even though that was the limit, there was no way anybody was going to let us build a 45-foot building, so we just canned the project and moved on with the post office. So I was looking at our project and that we filed on Friday. What would that look like if it was 45 feet tall? And I think that it would still be a great project, but right now I think there's a problem with the discussion at hand, and that is the FAR and the units per acre don't match up to 45 feet. If we built our project at 45 feet, it would have 33 units. And that's not pushing density at all, because our units are big. We've got 11 units per floor on our current submission, most of which are 1,800 to 2,600 feet. And we've got parking covering them all. But under the unit count that you've got as planned, we could only have around 23 units. And we would have 33 units at a 45-foot building. So I'd ask you to reconsider that density per acre. I would also ask you to reconsider the floor area ratio. Our building, again, if it was 45 feet, would be about 128,000 square feet. And that's because we have 56,000 square feet of parking. So I think by having, if you're counting parking towards the floor area ratio, which I'm not sure you are, we couldn't figure that out. I would ask for either a clarification that parking doesn't count, or an increase in that FAR. Because if you keep the FAR at 2, what's going to happen is you're going to have somebody, it wouldn't be me, I'd sell the property, but you're going to have somebody build a project with no parking, which is not what the town wants given the lack of parking that there is. So I would just make those 2 shorter and just see how that goes into this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions? Councilmember Rennie?
Yes, thank you for addressing us. So your current project that you've submitted, how tall is that? You were talking about a 45-foot limit. Have you submitted something at 45 feet?
No, we're well in excess of that. I don't remember how tall we are, but we're at 7 stories above ground, one floor of parking below. So I think it's 80 some odd feet.
80 some. Okay, so I'm trying to understand when you're asking us to change the FAR and the density and the height or not the height?
I didn't want to get into an argument about height. I know that we're going to be talking about my project a lot over the coming 6 months. So I just wanted to look at the plan that you guys have in front of you tonight. And at 45-foot height, the FAR and the units per acre don't match up. That was my only point tonight. And I know that because of all the time we've put the last 6 months planning our building. So all I wanted to do in coming to talk to you tonight was say, hey, if I built my building, which I think you guys will like, other than, appearance is subjective and height. If I built my building at 45 feet, what would it look like? And I couldn't build it because the unit count would be way too low and we couldn't build the parking. And I don't think anybody would want a building without parking.
So my question is, I'm trying to understand, you're asking us to change the FAR and the density so a 45-foot building works, but you're not submitted a 45-foot building. Why are you not asking us to change the FAR and density to work for the 80-foot building, you said?
Well, I've already got that submitted under builder's remedy, and I think it's going to get through, and I wouldn't come down here and ask you to change. I mean, you guys have been studying this for a long time. What you're considering tonight is a 45-foot limitation, and I came down here to tell you as owner of that and have studying this building that you could build a much better building at 45 feet given a higher density and a higher FAR than you could under the current things. The three don't line up together.
And
that's all I'm saying.
So what is the answer for 45-foot? What should the density be?
I'd say the density should be about 40 per acre.
And what should the FAR be?
The FAR is fine at 2 or a little over 2 as long as you don't count the parking. And you may already do that in the town code. There was conflicting information both ways. Under normal residential, you don't count the garage towards the FAR, but I couldn't find that, so it might already be there. But either way, if you're going to have a 2.0 FAR, you should explicitly say that it doesn't count garage space. My suggestion.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Hudes?
Yes, thank you. With regard to the zoning that's before us, are you requesting any changes to any of the architectural standards that are in place relative to neighborhood compatibility and things like that?
I didn't see that up for discussion tonight, so that wasn't part of my recommendation. I only wanted to speak to the FAR and the density. I haven't looked at all of the town regulations in regard to appearance of buildings other than those that were on the subjective list.
What would you describe the architectural style of the building, sir?
Of the existing building downtown?
No, of the one that's been submitted.
Geez, I don't know how we would describe it. I'd say a contemporary take on a classic building.
Would blockhouse architecture, monolithic, fit the description?
I wouldn't describe it that way, but I'm not an architect, so I wouldn't want to hypothesize about where it would fall in that. And I didn't come to discuss our building today. We'll be doing that a lot, but.
Thank you.
Councilmember Moore?
Thank you. Just appreciate you being here. And just so a quick question, so I'm clear. So my sense from what you're saying is that what we're talking about right here, the housing element overlay zone, really doesn't impact your actual proposal very much. You're just talking about the FAR and density specifically on, more generally.
I decided to come here at the last second. I was really reticent to do so because I didn't want to muddy up the waters with what we're doing versus this conversation. But as somebody that's been looking at this site, knowing that you guys are looking for residential units in your housing elements, and knowing what we've planned, I think that what you've shot for under a 45-foot height limitation is wrong on FAR and units. And that's all I wanted to come discuss. We're going to be discussing our building. We're going to be discussing the merits of builder's remedy. We're going to be discussing the merits of architecture. I just wanted to say, hey, if you guys are looking for units, you've missed the mark on the units, on the density per acre and the FAR on a 40-foot, 5-foot height limit at that location. And that's it.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to call our next speaker, and that'll be Lee Fago.
Good evening. I'm speaking as a citizen and not representing any group. But I have to say that this is an example of builder's remedy getting totally out of hand and compounding the problems that the community, our town, is facing in dealing with these mandates from Sacramento and what could happen to our town. I understand that the housing element is agendaed for a further discussion on the 19th of December. It is because we haven't been able to get any of our prior submissions approved. The council, I ask you to take responsibility as our citizen elected officials for managing the town's housing element process and getting the state ACD approved. You have resources, staff, committees, commissions, et cetera, and a lot of citizens who are engaged, but you're not managing the calendar. We're totally out of sequence. This is the 5th submission rejected because we've been trying to do the general plan, the housing element, and having public comment during a period where decisions have not yet been finalized. It's lack of control over the calendar, lack of control over the town resources. Please take responsibility and act accordingly. We need to get more citizen input, and we need to get some input as well in further discussions with HCD for clarity, and the new consultant should be reporting back to the Planning Commission and to the council as well as the town staff. And that's been not happening in a timely fashion. There were several meetings where the consultant was not, quote, available. So please, I ask the council to take control, spend the time to review and implement the terms needed, not just identifying an offensive buffer of sites to get an approval for the housing element before the further builder's remedies come into town and we see the complete character and the quality of life in this town change. Please act accordingly, and as an elected representative, it is the citizens' expectation that you would represent us in such a fashion. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fago. I see no hands raised, so thank you again. Ready to call the next speaker, Tony Alarcon.
Tony Alarcon, speaking as a town citizen. I wanted to speak here at the town council. I spoke about this at the Planning Commission. The town of Truckee has a similar population as our town, about 30,000 people. They had their housing element plan approved in 3 weeks. Ours has been taking way too long. I don't know what the leadership is doing and why we have now 4 submissions, because as previous speakers said, we now have builder remedies in place, 7-story buildings, probably going over Ace Hardware on Los Gatos Boulevard across from the North 40. I find it funny in a lot of ways that I hear people speak about how much they love their town. They've been here for 37 years. They have owned a certain property for a long time and looking for something to line up. And now I hear about 80 feet tall. I think we should just put 10,000 houses in the hills in Los Gatos, because that's all we're going to be able to see if you build 80 feet at the post office. My uncle rebuilt Old Town after the earthquake. The town needs to work with the owner of the post office, partner with them on underground parking, pay for underground parking like was recommended when Old Town was built and the town didn't want to pay the bill. Build underground parking, get the cars off ground level, put them underground so we can lower the height of the buildings. The building height of the post office should not exceed a point where we cannot see the hills. That's one of the great features of our town. It's iconic. And if we continue on this trend, we're not going to be able to see any mountains. Look back to the corner of Blossom Hill and Los Gatos Boulevard. When the dome was built, they wanted to build a higher height, and it was said no. Look on Highway 9 and the corner of North Santa Cruz. That building as well was kept down height to preserve the view of the hillside corridor. There is another builder, developer who lives in our town, who's built in our town. I'm not going to say his name, but I want to pay him respect if he's watching this meeting. He said he would not do the post office at 80 feet if he was the developer because he didn't want that look. So I'm asking the town council to work directly with the property owner of the post office and asking the owner of the post office to do the right thing by our town. Leave a legacy for your family, not a giant 80-foot tribute to concrete. The building should look somewhat like is on the corner across the street to stay historic with our town. So please work to find a solution so we don't have 80 feet. If that means increasing the FAR, please do so. I'd be happy to answer any questions should the council have them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alarcon. I see no hands raised. Thank you for your input. I'll be calling, I'm sorry, Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. So I had a quick question. So you're in this comment and the last comment, you've referenced Truckey's housing element. Do you know they doubled their RENA allocation? So they said they're going to build double the amount of units they were assigned. Is that the sort of strategy you'd like Los Gatos to take? Or I think we're in a really hard position, and so I'm wondering what you would recommend changing in the process to be more like these other municipalities.
The reason that Truckee doubled their RENA housing elements was to meet workforce housing requirements, to my knowledge. I do not think the town of Los Gatos has the infrastructure, roadways specifically, that we should double the RENA numbers. I think we should stay with the state numbers to get our housing element approved. I think that was part of the delay in the process. And then once we do that, we can add additional units in the future as we need them. So start small and comply, and then build out. Look at highest value land locations to use for best uses, and have the builders allocate other lower income and workforce housing units, creative structures, because low-income housing keeps poor people poor, whereas workforce and other housing like the TAMP program in Truckee, they do not limit equity growth on the house, which is the greatest wealth creator. Their restriction is they have to sell within a median income range, which for a family of four, I believe, was $240,000. And that can help a lot of town residents afford within that type of a program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No further questions. Thank you, Mr. Alarcon. Our next speaker is Stanford Stickney. Hi.
First and foremost, I want to say thank you. Teddy Roosevelt said it was the credit belongs to the person who's actually in the arena. Win, lose, or draw, you are working to better our town. And we need to acknowledge that, because it's very easy to point fingers and say how the doer of deeds could have done better. That's also part of that speech. I hope that the post office remains the post office. When my father grew up, he would talk about the train that ran through University and how the firemen would let him turn the train and how exciting that was. And for me, it's certainly not a train, but the post office represents a family, a collegial atmosphere. And I wonder if we look back in the past into the future, if we develop and we lose some of those gems, those precious things that make Los Gatos so unique, it'll be hard to bring it back. I thank you for your time and consideration.
And thank you. I see no hands raised. Thanks again. I'm going to ask our town clerk, are there any hands raised on Zoom that wish to speak?
There are no hand raised on Zoom.
Okay, thank you. With that, I'm going to close public comment, and I'm going to look to Ms. Armour if she had a response for Councilmember Hudes.
Thank you. We did take a look at the housing element, and it appears that the 350 number was added as one of the edits to the November version of the housing element. And that is there's a difference between what is projected in terms of what can be justified based on the town's past numbers of accessory dwelling units, and that 350 is actually a goal for one of the implementation programs. So the goal there is to try and go above and beyond what we have seen in the past for accessory dwelling units, since that has been very successful in the town. And so that is why the housing element consultant recommended that we could increase the number there, but the justification for the projection was strongest at 200 as previously listed.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Councilmember Rennie?
Thank you, Vice Mayor. So bringing us back to our decision here is whether to add the post office site to our list of AHOZ sites in our housing element and rezone it as such, basically. And what we had said last time was bring it back to us when it was obvious or reasonably obvious or potentially obvious that it would help us get our housing elements certified. And so I'm wondering, so you brought it back to us and you seem to be saying you think this is important to advancing our housing element certification with HCD. And I'm wondering if you're, and so I'm trying to connect this to their letter. And it seems like you're connecting it to the AFFH section where they're saying that we need to do actions to, and it says numerical targets and so forth, and geographic targeting that should fine-tune better promote inclusive neighborhoods throughout the town. And it says this is particularly important because we have over 80% of the lower income regional housing needs is isolated in 2 census tracts. And it also, for interest, it goes on, but it also goes on to talk about, needing to include focusing more housing and affordable housing, and even talks about missing middle housing in the lower density neighborhoods also. So the question is, are you saying that this is not in those 2 census tracts and it will help answer this question of what they're saying is they want housing, and this is completely new, we've never seen this before. They seem to be saying now, we want you to get some more affordable housing and some more missing middle housing spread throughout town. So is it staff's opinion that this is helping that? And they also, and I'll also put on that they're talking about lower density neighborhoods, but this isn't really in lower density neighborhoods. So will this really help is the question, or give us more of your thinking along whether this is addressing this.
Thank you for that question. And yes, as I said in my verbal presentation, there are a couple of different points in the letter, some that indicate an interest in having units shown more broadly throughout town. However, as I also shared, this site, because the density range was from 20 to 30 dwelling units per acre, we were not assuming affordable units on the site. Those units are placed on sites that have the 30 to 40 range. And so in that case, it isn't actually providing affordable units distributed through town. So this really was an opportunity for the council, now that we have additional input, if there was direction based on that. If not, then we can move forward. As in the written report, we have removed this site from the inventory because when we submitted the November version, it was important to be able to say that the rezonings had occurred. And so at this time, the most recent draft does not include this site.
So the follow-on to what you just said is, it sounds like rather than rezoning as an HEOZ, which is 20 to 30, we should rezone it 30 to 40, and then it would more likely address the letter?
Potentially. Again, because of the size of the site, it isn't a whole lot of residential units. And so it does not appear to be critical. If the density were modified to be increased, then we could potentially include some affordable units there. However, that would actually require us coming back to you for a modification, both to the general plan description and zoning description of the housing element overlay zone, which is not in front of you this evening.
One more question, if I could, Mayor. So what's the downside to, what's the potential downside to going ahead and zoning these? We, particularly in light of, we have a completed application for the site where we just heard from the developer that they don't think we can say no to their project, which is much larger. So how does taking this action hurt us? And you're saying it may help us with HCD, but how could it hurt us?
I don't have any specific direction on that. I don't know if the director has something to add.
Thank you. Through the Vice Mayor, Community Development Director Joel Paulson. I think, as Ms. Harmer mentioned before, this is such a small amount of units. I don't think it helps or hurts one way or the other to really make a significant impact in HCD's review.
Okay, so again, you were supposed to bring this back when we thought it would make a difference, and you're not sure whether it makes a difference, but you wanted to give council an opportunity to see if they thought it made a difference. Is that really the juxt of what we're trying to do here?
The other consideration for council is that we do have a requirement to rezone all of our sites on our site inventory prior to January 31st, 2024. So if council does want this site to be included, this would be a good time to make that happen, so that way the zoning is effective prior to that date. Staff did remove the site from the site's inventory as described in the staff report. So this one is completely at your discretion. If you think it helps, it's available for you to add, and we'll put it back in the inventory. If you don't think it will help, then our work is done.
Okay, thank you. And Vice Mayor, I was just trying to get to that. In my mind, the weighting of the risks of doing this versus not doing it, and I'm curious to hear what other council members think. Thank you.
I appreciate your thought process. Councilmember Moore, followed by Councilmember Hudes.
Thank you. So I'm going to dig hopefully just a little bit more into the functional impact of pulling the site, because what it seems like to me is that rezoning this, putting the HEOZ on it, functionally might give us a little bit more control over the site. And because, I mean, the elephant or lack thereof of an elephant in the room is that we have an application. And so we don't want to be talking about a pending application. So we're really talking about what someone else might apply for this site on. And to me, it seems that, adjusting the FAR and the density as is proposed would help us actually get a reasonable application that is somewhat consistent with our zoning. Because I think, what I'm hearing is that this 0.6 FAR really only this is just my perspective and the perspective perhaps of the developer, but that the 0.6 FAR is really only allowing for builder's remedy and SB 330 sites or proposals to be put here. So I'm trying to understand the functional impact of going one way or the other on what could actually be built here.
I'm not sure exactly what additional information you're looking for, but I can share that yes, the FAR right now for a site that doesn't have the overlay in downtown is 0.6. What would be proposed is 2.0. Many of the buildings downtown are actually already over the 0.6, so that is actually very common.
Okay, thank you. And so this wouldn't this doesn't impact anything that's proposed, right? This would be for a potential future application.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Hudas.
Thank you. We've heard the term pulling this site, but actually isn't that the opposite? Wouldn't, if we were to do the zoning, we would then have to re-add this site to the site inventory?
So the most recent draft of the housing element, the November draft, did not include this site. So if the overlay was added to the site, then staff would proceed based on that direction from town council to add it back into the site inventory.
And if I may, so if that's the case, then without getting into a value description about whether it's good or bad, is it true that would rezoning this site and adding it back to the site inventory incentivize development of that site beyond what is currently allowed in that location?
The change of the regulations from 0.6 FAR to 2.0, the increase in the density could potentially provide for more flexibility for a future development of the site within the regulations, though at this time we do have a formal application for redevelopment of the site.
Understanding that whatever we do here doesn't apply to a builder's remedy application that's in process, but it would apply to any future application that might come forward.
That's correct.
And so rezoning it and adding it back to the inventory would incentivize development in a way that is not currently permitted by our current zoning for that site.
It would allow an increased density and an increased FAR, correct?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or a motion? Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. I know it's hard. It's hard to look left. We're all right-handed, I think. So what I'm hearing here is that maybe it doesn't matter all that much one way or the other, but I think a functional impact here is by not rezoning and not increasing the floor area ratio, the FAR. To me, it seems that we're functionally only allowing for an SB 330 or potentially builder's remedy, depending on how our housing element site goes. Because what I'm getting at is that we just heard from the person who owns the site, right, that 0.6 is too low. They can't do that. And so I don't think I think by keeping it at 0.6, it feels like we're tying our hands behind our back. I actually don't think it functionally matters that much because we have an application, and SB 330 will still be on the table. So if someone chooses to do SB 330 in the future, they'll do that. But I think that rezoning allows us to actually have potentially more control over the process and potentially actually get an application that complies with our zoning and FAR. I think if we don't adjust it, we're only allowing for I don't think with what I've heard and all of the folks that I've talked to in the development community, people aren't developing at this density or this floor area ratio right now. It's just not, especially not in a downtown, right? So I think we tie our hands behind our back by not changing this. However, because I think it's, mostly performative one way or the other anyway, because of the application, I'm open to hearing, other thoughts on this. But I think that increasing, applying the housing element overlay zone and increasing the density in FAR actually gives us more control over a future project.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up. Would you like to try a motion?
I'd love to. Okay, so I will make a motion to approve of the staff recommendation in item 11, along with the draft ordinance. Town Attorney, is that appropriate?
Yes, and the staff recommendation is to introduce the ordinance.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second for discussion.
Okay. All right, I'll open for comment. Councilmember Hudis.
Thank you. I won't be supporting the motion for a couple of reasons. I don't think this site is appropriate to be on the site inventory in the first place. When it was pointed out that the council had approved the list of sites, that was before we learned that we had some additional buffer elsewhere. And that's where you need to start making trade-offs, in my mind, is if there are places that are better suited to satisfying the state requirement, places that may not cause as much impact on the community, then you start looking at which sites should be on the inventory. And I don't think that this warrants being on the inventory. And I also think, going back to the point that I asked a couple of times, that rezoning the site and adding it back to the inventory would in fact incentivize development of a higher density than is currently allowed by town zoning. And so I don't think it would be appropriate to do that. And again, not being a value judgment, I just think that it would in fact have that effect. I don't quite understand the point about it giving us more control. In fact, putting it on the site inventory, applying the affordable housing overlay zone takes away some of the control that we have in our current zoning by applying certain standards, and that is all the effect of what the rezoning would accomplish. The fact is that SB 330 is still out there, Builder's Remedy is still out there at this point, and we are subject to those things as well. But strictly looking at this from should we rezone this site, it just doesn't make sense to me. We don't need it, and it's not the best place for affordable housing, for housing in general.
Councilmember Rennie.
I don't really see either way making a difference, so I'll withdraw my second and let this go away.
Okay, motion fails. So with that, I'm looking at page 6 of the staff report, and now we have 3 alternatives. So I will look to council members if they would like to try another motion based upon our alternatives. All right, Councilmember Moore.
I made my motion, so I'm not going to make a motion, but I'll just respond real briefly. So what I'm trying to get at is that I think we're not being realistic with ourselves if we think that by not putting this on the housing element overlay zone, we will somehow curb development at this site. I think I've been sharing this with lots of folks in town. I think if we have a property owner that is interested in redeveloping a site and a developer that's interested in redeveloping that site will get redeveloped. And I think that's the situation we're in here. And so this site's going to be redeveloped, right? There's no, I mean, I could totally be wrong. I think that what I've been really trying to think about as we go through this housing element process and think about development in this town, I'm really trying to think about how we get good developments and developments that are, that the council can have some control over, right? That we can contribute to and weigh in on. And so I think by making our standards more realistic to what is actually being built, we are more likely to actually receive an application that conforms with our town code. And again, I won't die on this hill, but I am just trying to share that I think by trying to minimize the density and FAR and height as much as we can, I think we are making it so the only option a developer has is to develop under one of these state housing laws. And I think that's what, I think that's what we're going to see here.
Thank you. Councilmember Hudis.
Yeah, I appreciate Councilmember Moore's desire to try to help guide the process so that we have appropriate development. I would just say that I think that our current general plan and zoning designations do a good job of that. And by taking no action, in fact, those remain in place. And even if we were to rezone, that doesn't preclude a developer from applying SB 330 or builder's remedy. So I think the best approach is number 3, to take no action. I don't know if we need a motion to take no action, but that would be, I think, appropriate, because we do have very good zoning designations that allow for appropriate development with architectural standards and that protect hillside views. And those have served us well, and I think they will serve us well in the future.
All right, I'm going to look to Ms. Whelan. Do we need a motion if we take no action?
No motion is required for option number 3.
Any other comments? Seeing none, then we will close the item, and we will call Mayor Ristow back to rule with the gavel.
All right. I think we'll take a 5-minute break, because I got a break, but a few of my council members need one. So 8:22 actually, so let's say 8:30. We'll make it a couple-minute break. Thank you. Due to popular demand. Item 12, which is our story poll policy, and I will turn to our planning manager, Jennifer Armour, for a report on this item.
Thank you and good evening again, Mayor, Vice Mayor, council members. The item before you this evening is consideration of modifications for the town's story poll policy. As described in the written staff report, this item was last discussed by Town Council on August 1st, at which time direction was given to maintain the current regulations in many ways, particularly in our hillsides and historic districts, but to make changes to remove story poll requirements for certain qualifying projects, including projects with 30% below market price housing or 20% low income or very low income housing, non-residential additions that are less than 20% increase in floor area and do not include exception requests, and single-family residential projects that are either a single story or in height or involve a two-story home with no exceptions and requested in a neighborhood that has other existing two-story homes. In addition, direction was given to allow double flagging instead of mesh netting and to reduce the multi-building project requirements to just depict the outside perimeter and the height of the tallest building. There are 6 items listed in the written staff report, suggestions for discussion tonight. They include requirements for buildings over 55 feet in height, specifications for animated visual renderings, multifamily and mixed-use projects, timeframes for installation, public notice, and exceptions to the process. A desk item was provided to you today with specific recommendations that the Town Council could consider for further reductions in the story poll requirements, specifically in response to recent findings letter received from HCD. This concludes staff's presentation, but we would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And one thing I want to clarify is as we move through this, I think we should take each item and maybe do mini motions on each one as opposed to, because I have a feeling there might be some, anyway, that's how I would like to proceed. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Manager, for the desk item. I thought that was really helpful and was something that I was thinking about as we were, as we're thinking about how this intersects with the housing element. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more to, the recommendation is to further modify the story poll ordinance. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more to how that could potentially help our story to HCD and potentially get our housing element approved.
Thank you for that question. So yes, in the housing element, we do have an implementation program and have had for several iterations that talks about modifying the story poll and netting policy because it was identified by one of the public comments as a potential constraint to future housing development. In the latest version of the housing element, we did include some more detailed description of the modifications that were made by motions of the Town Council in August. And that does seem to have helped. However, it did remain as an outstanding comment from the state. And so in discussions with our housing element consultant, the idea of proceeding with additional changes at this time to show that the town is serious about reducing the potential constraints to development would help in future revisions to the housing element.
As a follow-on, so I'm clear. So the current modifications that we've already made to the story poll ordinance, HCD still, when they're talking about these requirements are constraints and impact housing costs, they're talking about changes we've already made. So they think our policy that we've changed some still presents a constraint.
That is our understanding, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Have we ever actually changed it or we're looking at changes?
So we did receive motions to make changes. We have not implemented those yet, but we listed those changes as items that had already been recommended by Town Council.
Okay, thank you. Vice Mayor Badami.
I believe we received a desk item that HCD is primarily concerned about the buildings over 55 feet. Am I correct in that? And that they would prefer that we have a requirement for video renderings and signage, and that might appease them?
Thank you for that question. That is what the staff's recommendation is at this time, because that is something that council had previously discussed as to what the requirements would be over 55 feet. That was the current recommendation from staff. We don't know because that was not a specific requirement from them. They did talk about reduced requirements, and there was some specific language there, but it did not specifically address the 55-foot height.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Hudes.
Thanks. And to follow up on Councilmember Moore's question about HCD, the proposed changes that are in the staff report now, has HCD reviewed those, and how do they view them?
Thank you for that question. The most recent draft of the housing element submitted to HCD included a description that modifications already approved by Town Council on August 1st included use of flag rope instead of netting, reduced story pole requirements for multi-building projects to just represent the perimeter of the site and tallest buildings, removal of story pole requirements for projects with 30% below market price housing or 20% low income or very low income housing. Additional modifications to further reduce impacts of story poles are scheduled for review by Town Council on December 5th. So that was part of the description of the implementation program and the work that was already done and part of their review.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up, what I'm talking about are the additional items that are listed in tonight's staff report. Were those discussed with HCD, and what was their view of those?
Thank you for that question. No, those items were not specifically discussed with HCD because we had not gotten direction from Town Council as to whether there was support for those modifications. Those were topics that had been previously identified for future discussion.
Is that something that staff plans to discuss with HCD next week when they're discussing their comments that address story poles to find out whether making those changes would satisfy HCD?
We will likely talk about what additional changes are needed and try and get as specific direction from the staff at HCD as possible. In looking at the language from their letter, it says that these requirements are constraints and impact housing costs and supply numbers, that approval certainty is required. And so these requirements should be removed or replaced with cost-effective measures to promote certainty for developers and the community. It does not give us specific direction on how to replace with cost-effective measures.
Councilmember Hudes.
Yeah, just one follow-up to that, which is essentially the question I had last time. Do we know what the financial impact of these changes would be, and in fact, would they be a constraint? You know, for instance, if the impact were $50,000 or $100,000 on a project that cost $100 million, you might say that's insignificant. What do we know? Have we modeled what the financial impact of these proposed changes, particularly on the 55-foot and moving to this alternative method of notifying the public? Have we any idea about whether it is a constraint or not?
Thank you for that question. At the previous hearings, we have had public comment that described the prices of different types of projects for the story poles and how it does vary significantly based on the scope of the project and the length of time that they need to be up. In addition to that, I think it is very clear from the comment letter from the state that they do still consider this to be a constraint.
Is that it? Okay. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the constraint. I mean, it says very clearly in HCD's direct comment to us, which, you know, it's interesting because I think a lot of HCD's comments to me read as pretty nebulous and not super clear. This one's super clear. It says, while the program now commits to revise story poles and netting policy requirements, these requirements are constraints and impact housing costs. And so I think regardless of anything, HCD says these are constraints, right? And I think that's what matters to us in trying to get our housing element approved. And so I'm trying to understand. So the reason for staff, the reason the suggestion of video renderings and signage was suggested was to decrease costs, right? As a response to them being a constraint.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me because, again, regardless of whether or not we think these are constraints or what have you, regardless of how expensive the project is, HCD says these are constraints and impact housing costs. And so I think we have to take that at what HCD says, because HCD is the one who decides whether or not our housing element is certified.
I have a question, and then I think we can probably move to public comment if we have any. The staff recommendation is to potentially waive story poles for buildings above 55 feet. But as I read the HCD comments, it didn't talk about story poles being a constraint above a certain height. They just called story poles a constraint. So I don't know what the right answer is, but I'm curious why staff chose 55 feet to say no story poles, and we would have story poles up to 55 feet. Because every project we've had so far where a developer has talked about the fees have been for buildings below that height, I think. So I'm just curious what the rationale was.
Thank you for that question. The reason that was the recommendation that we put forward was based on the previous discussion that Town Council had, where there was discussion but no specific direction as to what might be done for representing buildings over 55 feet in height because of the difficulty of installing story poles once they get to that height and above. And so rather than getting to examples where you've got cranes out there holding up the flags, that the idea that those could be represented with these animated visual renderings and signage as a way to avoid those more complicated installations.
Okay, thank you. So from my perspective, then what you're saying is, well, HCD has said that story poles can be a constraint. Staff recommendation is not to eliminate story poles, but you gave us an answer that we had left undiscussed or undetermined what to do above 55 feet.
Correct, and it is not clear how far we will need to go on this to satisfy HCD, but this seemed a pretty straightforward, based on the previous discussions, method for at least taking a step in that direction.
Okay, manager?
I just wanted to add that, you know, of course, the council can revisit any of the decisions that you made at the earlier meeting in light of the HCD letter or in light of other information, including public comment that you might hear tonight. So staff did not analyze the policy question of whether or not we should have story poles at all. Since that was not the question that council asked us. If that is a question council would like us to answer, we're happy to, but we did not because we were building on the work that you had done earlier in the year.
Thank you. It just seems like the HCD letter is new information for all of us. Councilmember Hughes.
Yeah, so just coming back to focusing on the buildings over 55 feet, do we know if there are other municipalities that have story pole requirements for over 55 feet? And If so, do they have a certified element?
Based on the survey that we did, they did not, the other agencies that we looked at in Santa Clara County did not have specific requirements based on the height of the building. It did not distinguish between them. But if you look at the requirements for some agencies, for example, San Jose, that might have more of these taller buildings, they do not have a story pole requirement at all. I can provide more details of what agencies we looked at if that would be helpful.
I think you provided that at the last meeting. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And I think at the last meeting, I can't remember the details, but there were some municipalities that have dropped story poles completely and others that still have a version.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions before I open this to public comment? All right. So I've got one card right now for Lee Quintana.
I don't really have a comment on what what you should propose or agree to. I just want to make the comment regarding animated visual renderings and question, if you do decide to do that, who would be the responsible party for doing the renderings? And I ask that because I've had experience with hiring somebody to do this type of rendering on a project. And when I said, and we do not want to make it look in favor of what we want you to be, it to be an honest rendering, the response that I got back was, well, that's a first. So I think it's important that we have impartial people doing that if that is what you're going to approve, because you really can manipulate what is seen by the video. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. So it sounds like whether we can control the people or not, we would want standards around. Are you suggesting that we have standards around what needs to be covered in a visual rendering?
What needs to be covered is different from how you cover it. And I don't know how you put standards around something if you're not in control of the something. What I'm trying to say is that if a developer were the one to hire the party to do this visual rendering, if that's what you're going to approve, they are likely to influence how that is done regardless of what the standards are that you apply to it.
Okay.
I don't know how you put standards on not creating a biased impression. And I think from my experience, that seems to be what happens when a developer hires somebody to do this kind of work.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Vice Mayor Badami has a question for you, so hold on to the mic for a minute.
Thank you. You know, staff offered an example. I don't know if you read the staff report having to do with animated visual renderings, but we could require that accurate representations of the height and massing of adjacent existing structures, videos that show the project from the street from a pedestrian level and speed, and views of all sides of the proposed structures, and a representation of how the building could affect views of the hill. Would that suffice as far as your concerns go?
My experience was with a project that was in a hillside area. I'm not going to say whether it was in Los Gatos or not. One of the ways that we wanted to see all of that you said, but also what it looked like from above so that you get an idea of the height in relation to other existing buildings. So I don't know. I don't know enough about this to know how you ensure that you get an impartial objective presentation. But I think that would be the important part to make sure you get.
Thank you.
Councilmember Hudes has a question for you.
Yeah, thank you. I think you raise an interesting point about who does the rendering. And, you know, much as we do with the arborist, when we're talking about removing trees, there's often the more than one arborist report. And same thing with consulting architect. Are you familiar with any municipalities that, you know, take a fee from a developer and then hire the individual to do the rendering? I think that's what you're suggesting.
Not specifically, but there are municipalities that do collect money from an applicant and then have a consultant that the municipality hires to do the actual work, as opposed to another way that communities do it is they allow the developer to hire their consultants, and the municipality just reviews it for accuracy. So there are different ways, but...
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you answered exactly what I was asking.
But with drones these days, it shouldn't be too difficult.
Okay. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Lee Fagot.
Good evening again. On this topic, I just wanted to underscore the comments that Vice Mayor Badami made when describing exactly the need, the reason, and the methodology for accommodating getting an image available from different perspectives on a site so that the neighbors and the full community understands what is potentially being built there. Interestingly enough, I also have a nephew who lives down in Southern California in Chatsworth, and he does drone as well as street videos. And he's worked both for property developers as well as for the a community right next to where he lives. And he has, depending on the site, made the videos getting a street view, a drone view, and also a 360-degree view around so you can get the right perspective for both the developer and for the municipality. It just depends on what that municipal government decides to do in terms of managing the process. So I think that gives the town an opportunity to manage this in a good fashion for objective data. So, thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. That's quite serendipitous. Thank you for sharing that. Do you feel, I don't know if you've seen them or not, but do you feel like those videos give a pretty accurate representation of the proposed project?
Yeah, he showed me one. It was interesting in that it was in the town of Chatsworth, in the hillsides, and Chatsworth is north of LA, and it was kind of interesting that he did it both from the street view. He also climbed a hill and did a view from there, and he also had a drone go around for this potential site. And it was a development that was housing, and it was eventually become senior housing. He did that about 18 months ago, and the project is still in process. And they had story poles there to give that kind of perspective as well. He had them put from the story poles sheets down at different levels so that it would show up better in the images. He said that's unusual. They don't usually do that, but he requested it and they did it. So, thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I have no cards left in the room. Do we have any hands on Zoom?
There are no hands raised on Zoom.
Okay, we have no hands raised, so I will close public comment on this item and turn to my council members for further questions or discussion in general. And then if that seems okay, do you want to go item by item or trying to? Sorry. Any comments or questions? Okay, well then let's go to, I apologize. I'm sorry, Councilmember Rennie.
I'm trying to decide if it's a question or a comment. As staff told us there, we're sort of focused on just buildings over 55 feet, but I'm trying to think back through the comments we've got, where they're saying that, they know we have a new program, but as was read, they still are considering our new program as constraints, as adding cost, and so forth, which is interesting to me because when I wonder if they really understood the whole program, because we did things like we said, well, if it's 20% low income, there's no story pole requirement, which is going to be a large portion of these projects that are coming. So that eliminates a lot of it. We got rid of the netting and went to flags in an effort to try to reduce the cost, and the part of the inefficiency and the uncertainty was we kept having projects that even at 35 feet where they couldn't do the netting because it was blowing over, and so we did flags to reduce the wind load and hopefully make it so that they could execute the story poles without having to come to us and get a change and so forth. So it seemed like we've already done a lot to improve that. But then when I go back and I read, I'm trying to, it's clear we've gotten comments from them and they haven't been completely clear what they want, and it's almost like peeling an onion. We get a little more each time of what they want, and I'm still trying to look below the layers of onions here in hopes of shortcutting some of the rounds with them. But so we left in the story pole requirements for all new single-family residences that are not going to have, that are not large, and I'm wondering if they didn't like that part of it also, particularly when I read their comments again on the AHF section. It says, these conditions and circumstances warrant significant and robust actions, not limited to RHNA, to promote housing mobility and increased housing choices and affordability throughout the town, including low-density neighborhoods. Action should be added to revise with aggressive numeric targets and so forth. Again, including low-density neighborhoods, they're talking about creating more housing choices and affordability in single-family neighborhoods beyond SB 9 and ADUs, such as missing middle housing, targeting affordable housing and home sharing and so forth. So they still think we should do more in that area, but if somebody's building a missing middle, it's not going to end up having 20% low, and so it might have the constraint from our current story pole policy. So I'm wondering if staff recommendations actually aren't quite enough to get us where we need to go. I may be asking the same question again if you want to make comments on that.
Thank you for those comments and kind of the embedded questions in it. And yes, there is a lot of uncertainty. The information that I wanted to share is that this item really is a combination of two things. We already were moving forward with this endeavor to update the town's story pole policy to reduce the impact that it has both on single-family homeowners as well as developments of affordable housing. And so that is a portion of the discussion that you're having here and the consideration for changes. On top of that, we do also now have these comments from the state and a question of how far we should be considering going in terms of making additional changes. With those comments, I will say that there are going to be a number of different ways that we're likely to respond to them, that story polls is not going to be the only way to address those comments. I don't know if the director has anything to add.
Thank you, Ms. Armour. So, I mean, I think that's the challenge is we're not HCD. We will definitely ask again when we meet with them. We see that this is a constraint. We're trying to make an effort to reduce that constraint and see if they provide any direct feedback. I want to say it was Los Altos, who was probably the most recent one that removed their story poll requirement. It was specifically from an HCD comment, so I don't know if they got more direct feedback from their reviewer, but that is definitely something that we'll want to look into next week.
If I can ask a follow-up question. So Los Altos has removed their story polls completely, like nothing gets story polled, not an addition, not a second story, and not a 5-story building?
Correct.
Okay.
And that is consistent with a number of other jurisdictions in the area: Campbell, Cupertino, Gilroy, Los Altos, Morgan Hill, Mountain View, San Jose, Santa Clara, and Sunnyvale. None of those agencies require story polls for any buildings.
Okay. Do they require visual renderings? Do they require a storyboard in front?
There are requirements for signage when there's new development going up. I have not looked into the details of what those signage requirements are, but I know that in looking at those communities, there are signage used for new developments.
Okay. And then to emphasize, these changes were precipitated by feedback from HCD?
For Los Altos, the city of Los Altos Hills, or the city of Los Altos. Los Altos Hills still has story poll requirements.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions along this line? So I guess, one of the things that's not an item in front, or not spelled out here, is if the council wants to discuss story polls in general, or do we want to go through this, address these areas that are outlined that we had talked about before, and work through this tonight, and then see if we have to do more work in response to HCD, asking staff in discussions to say, okay, these are the changes we've made, this is what we're doing, assuming we make changes tonight, and what further do we have to do and come back to us, or do we want to preemptively go deeper and further? Councilmember Rennie and then Councilmember Hudes.
I would just say I'm a little worried this is going to add another cycle or two to our HCD submittals if we're just tweaking around the edges on this. I still like the idea of keeping story polls for the hillsides, and I'm hoping that won't be something that they care about. And we could even keep it in the historic resource inventory. That seems to make sense, but the bullet that says that we're requiring story polls for single-family residences under certain conditions, I think is going to be a problem. And it seems like we should replace the story poll requirement with video renderings and signage instead. Or we could go the route of tweaking this and having HCD tell us to do it again after the next submission. I mean, it really depends on how many more months we want to spend at this. I'll let next council member speak.
Okay, Councilmember Hudes.
Would it be possible to discuss any changes that we make tonight with HCD this coming week?
We could bring that up as part of that discussion.
Okay, thank you, because to me that would make more sense than guessing and undoing what we did last time. Remember the story poll requirement is a way of letting people know that development is coming and somewhat the impact of that development. And yes, we want to satisfy HCD, But HCD isn't our only master. We need to meet the state requirements, but I don't think we should be in the business of guessing how far we would go beyond those requirements at the cost of residents being uninformed about development. The story polls serve a purpose. We've certainly made them less stringent, much less stringent in the last round, and now we're talking about how to move forward. So I'm kind of, interested in getting at the 5 or 6 specifics and talking about how we might be able to implement those, and then taking that to HCD if it's a matter of having a discussion this coming week.
I'll go to Councilmember Moore and then back to Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you. So I generally agree with what Councilmember Rennie said. I think that we just heard from HCD on this, that what we've said we want to do is not satisfactory. And again, and I'll keep harping on this until our housing element is approved, I have heard over and over again from our community that their top priority is for us to get this housing element approved. And so I think if making some changes that I don't think are, I think we can do it in a way where, I think Councilmember Rennie's kind of ideas of keeping it in the hillsides, keeping it in the historic, and we can talk about other things too. I think those are good ideas, and I think that gets us a lot closer to where we want to be. I think we just heard from HCD on this 4 days ago that our story pole ordinance is a constraint. And I think that all of HCD's comments, a lot of HCD's comments are all about removing constraints, and so I think I'm interested in talking about the policy more broadly and seeing if there's anywhere where we can get potentially some middle ground on removing some of the requirements we have in the policy right now.
Thank you, Councilmember Rennie.
Talking with HCD is always a good idea, but we're on submittal 4 now, and every single time we have discussions beforehand, and we think we understand what they're saying we can do, and then we get written comments back, we go, what? That's not what you told us we needed to do. We do what they say, and then it's almost like somebody completely different writes the comments that we have to follow. So it's helpful, but it's not sufficient to have these discussions with HCD outside of the actual written feedback, because they aren't following what they're telling us. And if we trust that, we're going to be at this next year at this time also. So I'm fine with talking to them, but I just want to be careful that it's really not getting us to the solution, because we've seen over and over again their verbal direction is not the same as what the written direction is that we have to follow. It's frustrating, I'm sure, for staff, and frustrating for me for sure, that we can't get correct direction from this. Did town manager want to comment on it? No? Okay. So, I don't necessarily think we have to take action tonight. We can have a discussion next week with them, and I think it should be something, suggest to them, is it good enough to remove story pole requirements for all housing projects outside of the hillsides and the historic resource inventory and replace them with video and signage? That seems like it should please them, but we can ask them and see what they say.
Maybe I will just make a comment. There was a question earlier about, are there any certified housing elements in which the jurisdiction does have story poles? Los Altos Hills is such a jurisdiction, and they have a program in their adopted and certified housing element that the town will develop a process to streamline the story pole requirement, or will allow renderings to be produced in lieu of story poles. And this is in a certified housing element. So I don't know how indicative it is, since it seems we're getting a different level of scrutiny, but that is an example of a certified housing element.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on that too, because I share Councilmember Rennie's frustration with every single letter we get back. There are things that didn't come up in the discussion. There are things that we comply with after one submission and then we're told to do it a different way. So I'm a little nervous about making a decision based on a conversation, you know, if we're going part way, or asking them what would it take, how much story pulling can we have, and will this be okay, because we can't count on that ultimately. The other thing that I go back to is, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I do remember before we had story polls. And so, you know, when my husband and I remodeled our house, we had to do shading drawings and, you know, show them to all the neighbors and everything. But this was before there were story polls. So at some point, we came up with story polls so that people can see a general shape of what's going to happen. We didn't have humongous buildings. We had mostly home remodels or something coming up. And at that point, there also wasn't technology to show what the potential building looked like, except for a drawing or a storyboard. There wasn't, you know, computer-generated rendering or fly around or anything. So I just want to be a little flexible where we can think about, are there more cost-effective ways? Because probably 20 years ago or 15 years ago or 10 years ago, if you had said we want a computer-generated fly around, that might be more expensive than story polls. At this point, it's less expensive, and it can be informative to anybody that actually can't visit the site. I know that it's become kind of the understanding when you suddenly see orange in the air, you know something's coming. I mean, I react the same way. If I'm on a hike and I look down and I see orange anywhere in town, especially this time of year, it's like, are leaves changing or is a building going up? So, you know, I think I am acutely sensitive to what it means for our residents if they're accustomed to a certain way to be notified of a building and then we change it. On the other hand, the very most impactful buildings will not have story polls. The things that will potentially affect every single person in town, we wouldn't be story polling, and we'd be putting the burden on a homeowner who maybe is putting a second story on, as opposed to somebody who's putting in an 85-foot building. So I'm trying to think about the whole thing in toto, and I actually think it's a worthy discussion tonight, because putting this off and waiting to get feedback from HCD in a conversation is not going to tell us ultimately if this is going to be enough. And I do think that story polls can be a real impediment. I think they are a burden for staff, in fact, because when somebody puts up the story polls, it's not just that you throw the story polls up. They have to match exactly where the building's going to be, how tall it is, so many inches, so many feet. It has to match the plan, and then it has to be verified. So it is a lot of work, and I'm just looking at ways to streamline this without losing public notification. So I think we're going to have to think carefully, if we do want to eliminate or reduce story polls, how we make sure that people understand what they're going to see. Councilmember Hudes.
Yeah, I would just appeal to us to talk about the subjects that are in the staff report, you know, because I think some of them apply whether we eliminate story polls or not, and I think that particularly the visual renderings, I think there's some issues around that. So I'm eager to get to that stage of the discussion, and you know, the perhaps someone will put a motion on the table about eliminating story polls altogether, and then we'll have a discussion about that. But if it's possible, I think it'd be useful to talk about these.
No, that's actually an excellent point. So, because you're right, we can resolve some of these that may be independent of whether we have story polls or not, or if we eliminate for 55 feet and up and then we come back and do something else. That's a great point. Okay, well then I'll direct us to A, buildings over 55 feet. And it discusses that one of our motions was, let's see, mesh netting or double flagging up to 55 feet. So the question is, what do we do above 55 feet? So let's handle that first. Councilmember Moore and then Vice Mayor.
So I thought you just had a very good point, Mayor, which is that it's interesting that we're talking about, the most impactful sites are the ones that are over 55 feet. And those are the ones where we're saying we're going to not have story poles. So again, I'm happy to have this discussion. I do think we should talk about it more generally this evening. But I don't think balloons are necessarily going to be a good indicator of what a project looks like. I think maybe this is where we can talk about. I think it makes a lot of sense, for unstory-poled proposals in general, but here for buildings over 55 feet, to have a very large sign, and I think we could decide we need signs every, how many 100 feet we decide, and on those signs, a QR code and website link to accurate, realistic visual renderings. And I thought Ms. Quintana's comment about perhaps those visual renderings need to be approved by town planning staff for accuracy, because I could see someone gaming that system. But I think that would be a good place to start is large signs and accurate visual renderings.
Okay, sort of along the lines of the staff
Definitely, yeah. Just
recommendation.
just not balloons.
Okay, Vice Mayor.
I actually agree with Councilmember Moore. I don't like the idea of balloons, especially when it gets windy and they pop and they blow away. So I would be amenable to staff's recommendation that we include a requirement for video renderings and signage. I don't know how we go about signage. That would probably be another conversation as to what should be required with that. Unless it's something that's incorporated with item B, where we go on to talk about, what it might look like with views of the hills, et cetera. QR codes might help some, but not all, such as a person like me. But that's my comment on item A.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Hudes.
Yeah, I think the video renderings, the virtual renderings are a good idea. I think we have to address accessibility to those. We have some folks who maybe don't have access to the technology to view them. We have some folks who are economically disadvantaged, and we have some folks who are technically challenged. And so I think we need to think through how we would make those renderings available to the public, perhaps including some of those on the sign, which would make it bigger, might help, but also having access, easy access to this available. The other side of it is sort of the notification aspect of it, and that isn't really served by having a rendering. So I would be interested in what ideas we might have. I find that our current website, that you have to go by alphabetical order, you have to know the address, the name of the street, and then go by alphabetical order and repeatedly check it to see if something is coming, is not effective. So I think maybe having video renderings, virtual renderings or visual renderings accompanied by an improvement in our website that would allow people to know about things much more easily would make them effective. Just doing them and creating a file and putting it somewhere doesn't accomplish the notification aspect of it. So I would think that would be something that could be achieved with eliminating the need for flags or for netting over 55 feet.
Thank you, Councilmember Rennie.
And those ideas all sound good. I just want to, staff already has it in item B, but I want to reemphasize that we want renderings that show the massing related to the adjacent existing structures, because that's what you would be able to do if you were out on the site with a story pole, is you'd be able to compare it to what's next door, and you're going to be on the street level. I worry about these flyovers where you can't tell, you know, all the videos are flyovers, right, where you can't tell really how tall it is. You need, you know, you can do those too, but you need to have videos where the person's standing so they can actually see better the mass of the building. And then the third part is that staff listed as representation of how the building could affect views of the hills. I think those are all important pieces to replacing story poles.
I agree. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about is, you know, we did do kind of a test run with this with the Winchester assisted care building, where we had big signs there that, you know, talk about the project. I think if we're going to have these signs, we want to specify a size, we want to specify a spacing. I think on that sign you have to have a rendering of the building and presumably a person on there for scale. And I think, yeah, when we get to the animated visual renderings, to me it's informative to have the three things. One would be the streetscape, where you can see the building in context with the surrounding buildings, you know, straight on, with a person height in there, a couple people. And another is, I do think the flyovers on top are important because it shows the building in the context of where it is and what the footprint is. So for example, if all the parking's underground, you will know that. You won't see parking spaces, or if they're behind or whatever. And then, yeah, where, you know, maybe we want certain views of the hillsides or certain views from across the street and there, and see what's happening there. But I am feeling like for buildings over 55 feet, the only option that makes sense to me are the boards at the site with a QR code for those who are who carry smartphones. And, you know, that means somebody has to come to the site. And then maybe, you know, for those who don't have that technology, our library always has, you know, the option to go in and be able to access the website and get assistance for how to see it. And, you know, that is a resource for a lot of our residents. But I also agree that the website for the pending projects, I know that we can't always do it the same way, but in the past when you went to the map, you could look on the map, click on it, but it doesn't take me to the documents anymore. I'll have to check it again. It's not working the way it did originally. Ms. Armour, can you please explain what our options are with that?
Thank you for that question. Yes, we do have the two options. All of the projects are listed by property address. We also do have a link to a Google map so that you can see on the map where projects are, and they are noted based on color and shape, based on project type, so you can have a sense of what's there. If you click on the item, it will give you a summary of the information, but it doesn't have the ability to link to the documents. So you would then need to go back to the page, now that you have the project address, to then look for more details.
Okay, thank you, because we used to be able to click on the site and get all the documents. And I agree with Councilmember Hudes. It's really frustrating if I see a project, I don't know what the street is, and heaven help me if it's on something like Los Gatos Boulevard and they're all 5 digits and I don't know which property I'm looking at. But knowing that, and then click on the site, and then you get the address and then you can pull it up and you get the summary. Okay, so I think that is important because we want to make sure our residents can get access to this. Councilmember Hudes.
I had a question, and if you wanted a motion, I could do it on A.
That sounds good.
Okay, the question is the existing SB 330 and Builder's Remedy applications and pre-applications. Would they have to comply with any changes that were made here, or have they vested in the requirements that were in place at the time their application was deemed final?
They've vested to the standards that applied at the time that pre-application was deemed submitted.
Okay, so they would not have the benefit of the changes that were made tonight, is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
I guess the question I have then is, like a 7-story building, what are the standards in place for that?
The current standards require story pole netting, mesh netting, or a request to town council for an exception.
Okay, so as we adopt this, we could keep this in mind, as that will be the exception when someone suddenly realizes they can't do story, or they don't want to do story poles and netting for 7 stories, or they have the option to do story poles, correct?
Correct, that the story pole requirement would be what it was when that preliminary application was deemed submitted.
Okay. I'll go back to, Councilmember Moore and then Councilmember Hudes.
Thank you. Could we opt to, in our motion, to make it retroactive? Sorry, and I'll just add on. I think for me, I think we'll just, I would just approve all of the ones over 55 feet because we've determined that it's not realistic. So I'm wondering if there's any way to make that more seamless, or if that just makes it more complicated.
The policy could state that it is retroactive. If an amendment to the policy could be made retroactive. I guess another way to say that is it could exempt certain projects.
Okay.
Thank you. Councilmember Hudes.
Yeah, I wouldn't be in favor of doing that because the status of these is, I don't even know that we have an up-to-date status on every one of them. Some of them are pre-application, some are finaled, and some are just recently finaled, that it's difficult to evaluate on that basis. So we do have the exception process that I think can handle them. So I'm going to make a motion on A, which is to adopt the staff's recommendation, but to exclude balloons, but to include all the other language that's noted in A.
Thank you. And I think we had a recommendation in the desk item for this that was more updated.
Sorry, I don't have that in front of me.
Oh, okay. Did everybody else see that? Or Ms. Emmer, can you talk us through, I could read it, but if you could explain what the difference is between what was in the initial report and what's in the desk item and what Councilmember Hudes has proposed.
Thank you for that question. From what I've heard of the motion by Councilmember Hudes is that it would be revising the policy to impose video renderings and signage requirements for buildings over 55 feet in height. And the understanding based on that is that story poles would not be required as described in the desk item.
Okay. We have a motion. Councilmember Moore.
Yeah, I'll second the motion. And that's I think pretty much exactly what was in the desk item.
Yeah, perfect. Vice Mayor?
I was going to second it as well. I'll be supporting the motion.
All right. It looks like we can call the question. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
No one opposed. The motion passes unanimously, 5-0. So with that, we'll move to, I gotta switch documents. We'll go to the next section, which talks about the renderings, and Councilmember Hudes.
Yeah, again, I think the staff recommendation covers some good aspects of accurate representations, and I didn't really hear or see anything to add to that. The only thing I would suggest adding would be Ms. Quintana's suggestion that the visual renderings be performed by a body that the staff hires with fees paid by the applicant.
I'll second that. I feel like yeah, you couldn't make this kind of subjective. And then initially I was thinking maybe staff could review the rendering and say, oh, does it meet all the criteria? But that becomes subjective. So I think it would be objective if we say we have the following 2 qualified, firms that you can use. I think that makes sense. And then we have our criteria, and we know that our pre-approved consultants understand what we're expecting from it. And kind of as a side note, the Winchester project, when they showed their renderings, it was clear it was also kind of an advertising. It flew through, it showed the inside of the buildings. We don't need to see the inside, we're looking at the outside. And so I think having kind of a standard way that we want the video renderings done would be helpful. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to get staff's perspective on those 2 options of, hiring someone that we kind of have on retainer, or having the renderings be approved.
Thank you for that question. I'll start, though the director may have something to add as well. The way that we do use consultants for similar items at this time is that we do put out a request for proposals or a request for qualifications, and then we do have 1 or 2 consultants available, for example, for environmental review or for arborists review, to do that work. At this time, we don't have anyone specifically on contract to do that, but as I said, the director may have something to add.
Thank you. I think Ms. Armour covered it well, and I would say from a staff perspective, having dealt with this many, many moons ago, which I'm sure is even more complicated now, there is stuff that you have to get down into the layers of the code to see what they tagged it to. So that's not expertise staff has.
Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Hudes.
Yeah, I would just express a preference for the method that the vice mayor and it seems staff suggests. I think the idea that staff approves, well, staff has to approve anyway if these things are going to be part of a staff report. So I think having qualified consultants and staff being involved at that degree would give us the objectivity that we're looking for. So I don't know, I could make a motion. Folks are ready for it.
Or add it to the, we have a motion and a second.
On this one? Oh, I'm sorry.
You made it and I seconded it.
That was on the first one. That was on the 55.
No, we're on the second.
I'm sorry.
I believe Councilmember Hudes was just making a comment.
Oh, and I seconded it, his comment. Oh, okay. All right, I apologize. Would you like to make the motion to cover everything?
Sure. I move to adopt the staff recommendation on B for specifications for animated visual renderings, and to add that the renderings will be performed by a consultant that's approved by staff in a similar manner to other consultants that we use for subject matter expertise.
Thank you, and I'll second it. And I would say that given that right now when we do story polls, staff has to approve them. Similarly, I would hope it would be hopefully an easier process, but a checklist. Okay, you've got the top view, you've got this, you've got that, you've got a person. So I hope this doesn't create an extra burden for town staff. Councilmember Moore.
The one thing that we've talked about that isn't in here is that I think we should clarify that the developer pays for this.
Yeah, always, right? Or does that need to be specified?
Go ahead and specify it, but that was our assumption.
Yeah.
Okay, that was my understanding, so I'll add that to the motion.
Okay, second. Thank you. Any other comments? I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
No one opposed. Motion passes 5-0. All right. Our next item is multifamily and mixed-use projects, talking about how We rely on story pole requirements for residential projects, non-residential projects, properties in the historic resource inventory, and properties in the hillside area. So where do we want to go with this? Or Ms. Armour, do you want to?
If that's a question, I can clarify that in looking at this in the past, when we talked about residential projects, we were generally talking about individual detached single-family homes. And so it may be that the council wishes to have something specific when talking about multifamily or mixed-use projects to make sure there is clarity as to how the policy applies.
Okay, Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. So I think if I don't know whether or not there is an appetite or majority to remove story poles in their entirety, except for hillside and historic. So if there's not, I think this could be a good place where we could remove story pole requirements and make that case that we've done some elimination of story poles to HCD, especially on these projects where we're getting more affordability, we're getting more of the project types that we are incentivizing in our housing element through multifamily and mixed use.
The area I would not be okay with is removing it from the hillside or historic resource inventory.
Right. So I was saying if there's not the appetite to go that far, then maybe this is somewhere where we could remove them. Yeah. So no, I was saying that. I'm sorry if I misspoke.
Okay. So remove. Okay.
Right. So to restate. So if there's not the appetite to remove story pole requirements except for historic and hillside, perhaps what we could do as a middle ground is remove them in multifamily and mixed use.
Okay. And what about residential projects not in historic and?
Right. So I think that's the bigger conversation. I'm just looking at
but right now, take
here.
the easy
I mean,
part.
I'd be interested in that too. But
okay. Any other comments, thoughts on this one, Councilmember Rennie?
Let me make sure I understand. So you want to remove the requirement or move it or change it to the video and signage?
Video and signage, definitely video and signage.
And I started thinking on small projects, maybe we want to give them the choice, because if I'm just building a duplex, which is multifamily, I might not want to pay for a whole video rendering. It might be easier for me to throw up some story poles. So a choice might be better than removing it.
That'd be fine with me.
Councilmember Hudes.
So if this were to revert to commercial or non-residential, is there any distinction between on size of these duplex projects, a multifamily or mixed use projects, or is it, does anything apply to that, or is it just all the same?
Thank you for that question. So the current requirement for story poles for residential is generally what we would use if it was a single family or a duplex project. And the question then is, if you have more than just a duplex, if you're going for a larger multifamily building, then is that considered commercial or not? It is not clear based on this policy. And so that was the suggestion, that make sure that there is clarity as to which set of requirements should apply based on council direction.
Councilmember Hudes.
Just as a follow-up, so what if this were in, what zoning would this apply to?
So there are numerous zones that could be allowed to have multifamily or mixed-use projects. Most of our commercial zones do allow mixed-use projects that could have residential as a component. In the low-density residential at this time, the uses are just single-family and, in some cases, duplex uses.
So this would not come into play in low-density residential where someone were wanting to put up a multifamily.
So it would be based on use rather than zone. The current regulation or the current policy is not based on zoning designation. It's based on the proposed project use.
So if the question is, would it be possible to do a multifamily or mixed use in low-density residential that would trigger this?
At this time, that is not an allowed use in those zones.
Okay, thank you.
I guess I have a question. So where something is allowed right now, based on what we just did with A, story poles are required for everything that is below 55 feet or lower, except for the affordability level that we talked about. Is that correct?
Based on the previous motions in August, that actually was reduced. For example, if you're not in the hillsides or in a historic district, if there was a single-story home, detached home that was being built, that would not require story poles. If it was a two-story home or a second-story addition, and one of the adjacent homes was already 2 stories, that would not require story poles unless they were requesting an exception. If it was an addition to a commercial structure that was less than a 20% increase in the FAR of the existing floor area, then that would not require story poles. But all new commercial would require story poles.
Okay,
unless it was over 55 feet.
Thank you for the reminder. I apologize. I'm looking at this and then trying to remember what we already changed. Councilmember Moore, I saw your hand.
Yeah, so I mean, I would think we're talking about what is in the staff report here, so it might be helpful to make a motion, and then we can talk about that motion. So I'll make a motion to remove the story pole requirement on multi-family and mixed-use projects, and require what we required in A and B, the visual renderings and signage.
Okay, Councilmember Rennie.
So we talked about making it an option rather.
Right. Please make that friendly amendment if you'd like.
I will second it if you make that friendly amendment to allow it as an option.
Yeah.
Okay.
Second.
Thank you. So we're talking about removing this, replacing it with signage and a rendering, or the option is to do story poles. Property owner's choice or developer's choice. Okay. Any other comments? Vice Mayor?
Yeah, question for staff. I mean, we're doing guesswork again, but what are your thoughts on this particular motion appeasing the HCD? Would it make a difference?
Thank you for that question. I think this does reduce the barrier. It provides an option that is expected to be less expensive. I won't go any further than that in predicting. The one clarification I did want to ask, when mentioning mixed-use projects, I assume, but I would like clarification that that is just projects that include a residential component.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, and that's good with the seconder. All right, any further discussion? I'm going to call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so motion passes 4-1. Councilmember Hudes voting against. So now we will move to D, which is a time frame for installation where our current story pole policy requires the poles be installed and maintained until a decision's been made and the appeal period is ended. And the recommendation by the Planning Commission was to limit this to 30 days. And we had not discussed this further. So I have one question for staff. I mean, I realize it's going to vary all over the place, but if we had the current story pole policy, I know that we've had situations where story poles are falling down and a project drags out, there's the appeal process and then it goes to the council and then things get continued. Can you give me an idea in general? If we limit it to 30 days, would that mean that the story poles might not be up when it comes to council if there were an appeal?
That is correct. If a project was not originally going to town council directly, then by the time the 30 days has passed, and they were removed, or that would occur prior to coming to town council.
Okay. And we're looking at a limited number of places where we would be doing story polls, presumably for the people that opt not to do story polls and do a visual rendering and a computer generated, that's going to last. So it's just the physical story polls. If someone opts for story polls, that we would be looking at a limited time on that.
And for those where the story polls are still required.
Okay. Councilmember Moore.
So sorry that this is a little bit of a jump, but I think this is important to talk about here too. I think the signage, we should probably, I would be in favor of keeping it up for the life of the proposal. I don't think there's any reason to take down the signage, so that might be something we would want to include in here. I don't think that should be taken down after 30 days or what have you.
Thank you. I have a question. When story polls go up, is there signage in addition?
So at this time, the installation of story poles and signage are coordinated because there are now going to be situations where signage is allowed when story poles are not. The current proposal, I believe, has the same public noticing timelines for signage. So signage would have to be installed prior to sending public notice of the hearing and would need to stay up through the entire process until all appeals are expired.
Okay, so the signage and the story polls are decoupled, and the signage will stay even if we decide story polls can come down in 30 days.
At this point, the motions that have been provided are that there are some cases where signage would be required. We would keep the same timing for signage. And then if the council chose to shorten the timing for story polls and netting, then those could be decoupled.
Okay. Councilmember Hudes.
Do we have situations where an application comes in and story polls go up, and then the hearing doesn't occur for some time, or there are appeals and changes that are made, and then residents go out and look at the site?
Yes, there are times that there is extensive time that they are up before the public hearing, or changes are made. In some cases, a second set of netting is requested to reflect those changes.
Okay, thank you. And I'm wondering again with this one whether there's any indication that this time frame for story polls is an objection that HCD has expressed.
No, however, we have had public comment that story poll, the extent of time that they are up, does add to the cost because there is a rental fee based on how long they are installed.
Councilmember Hudes.
But as a follow-up, we don't know what that cost is or whether it's a constraint from the research that we've done.
No.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. My concern with story polls staying up for a long time is that they need regular maintenance. They do start to look really ratty. And on a site where it's redevelopment, they can't impede the use of whatever structure is there. So if it's not an empty lot, if it's a shopping center or someplace that's doing an addition or being redone, you've got the guy wires, you've got the story poles, and it really is an impact on that property. So I'm leaning toward, I'm leaning toward having the story polls come down 30 days after the first hearing, assuming that maybe we put the request that photographs of the site with the story polls, in addition to, signage that shows what the project would look like, actual photographs of the story polled area be included with the packet, online or something, so that we don't have this sorry state of things coming down. I realize the mixed message for our public is that when the polls come down, they're expecting construction to start immediately, or they think the project's never going to happen. But even if we kept it up for 90 days or the whole time, from the time that story polls come down and the time a project starts, there's still a big lag. So have mixed feelings, but I can see the merit of not keeping these up for extended time. Councilmember Rennie.
Actually, I like your idea of pictures, because when I looked at this, the one thing that bothered me a little bit was when these projects sometimes come to council, it's going to be long after 30 days, and we as council members won't be able to go out, and I've found it to be somewhat useful tool to be able to go and see the netting. So if instead there's pictures of it, then that helps the council review, I think. So I do like the picture idea.
I think we would probably want some objective decisions about what type of pictures, how many, and from what angle. I mean, I think it could go along the lines of what we're talking about with the computer generated, on the street, street view, hillside view. We may not get a top view unless somebody has a drone, but right, okay. Yeah, that's true. If someone's getting a top view, I want to know how they're doing it. But full view from all sides. And I think as a council member, then when we go out to the site to look at it, we've then got the pictures at least, and we can understand the site. So that would be kind of where I'm leaning. I don't know. I'd like to hear from Councilmember Hures.
Yeah, having been on the Planning Commission for some time and having heard from residents that the story polls are very helpful to them. When a hearing is coming up, sometimes these things are, go on for a long time, and that's really the purpose of the story polls, is for the residents as well as the council members to be able to visualize the project. And so I think putting them up for 30 days is really just perfunctory, and they can check it off and say, yeah, we did it, but it doesn't serve the purpose. So I think if they're going up, the current policy to be maintained until a decision has been made and the appeal period has ended makes sense, and that's what the story polls are there for. And I don't think there's been any testimony or any evidence that creates a real burden, a material burden to development, particularly since we've had lots of development and we've streamlined the requirements for story polls in this whole process. So we still get some development. So I don't think that it makes sense to eliminate that requirement. The story polls serve as a visual indication of something that's coming, and also allow people to view the orientation of the building and whether it's blocking the hillsides, and whether they think they're going to have a problem with shadows and things like that. So limiting the time doesn't seem to be productive.
Vice Mayor.
I agree with those comments. One of the differences between planning commissioners and council members is that planning commissioners aren't supposed to engage with the residents, whereas council members were the last line of defense, where residents want to talk to us. And if you go on site, we have the opportunity to engage with them and probably walk around the building where they can point out the story pole. But once we eliminate that, it's kind of difficult, I think, for us to do our on-site and engage with the residents with their concern.
Thank you. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if 30 days is the right number. Maybe it's 60 to make it more likely that if a project is appealed, council can see them. But for me, and that's more trying to meet in the middle. I don't think, for me, it's actually funny. As I'm thinking about reviewing these projects that come before us, I think I will find visual renderings much more useful than story polls. And so I would kind of prefer visual renderings for a smaller project or what have you, but that's not where we're at right now. And so I think, pictures of story poles is kind of the next best visual rendering, sort of ironically. But I mean, maybe we can do 45 or 60 days. We're more likely to see it before council. But I think I would be fine with pictures of the story poles as a backup if there is an appeal.
Thank you. I mean, I do really view them as problematic. When I talk to homeowners that have story poles up on their property, they've got to be careful that their kids or the adults themselves don't clothesline themselves. I've seen the story poles up where there are residences and, there's a little bit of orange flag, but it's really problematic. And I think depending on the time of the year, they're going to take a lot more maintenance. Maybe the right number is 45, but I think the longer they stay up, the more maintenance they're going to need, the more visually ugly they're going to get, the more expensive it is. And if they are rented, then definitely the price scales with time. So you can just see that gets more expensive. I'm sympathetic to the thought that as a council member, if you go out to meet with the residents and you're looking at the project and the story poles aren't there, that could be a problem, but you've got the drawings in front of you. I've had residents point out to me, okay, this is going to be just this many feet from my fence. I mean, they'll talk about it before something's even story poled. So I don't know. I find it compelling that the story poles are problematic and expensive, and I would think that I'm in favor of limiting how long they're up there. Vice Mayor.
I have a question for staff. If you could refresh my memory, if we were to maintain the story poles on the project until the appeal period is ended, how long is the appeal period for?
Thank you for that question. The appeal period is 10 days following the hearing. However, if the initial deciding body is the Development Review Committee, that would be 10 days. It could be then appealed to Planning Commission, which then could be appealed to Town Council. It is also sometimes the case that after the first hearing, the project comes back to Planning Commission with revisions. And so the two other things that I would share is that if a Planning Commission decision is appealed, it is required to come to Town Council within 56 days of that hearing, but there's no guarantee that there'd only be one Planning Commission hearing. And the other item is that we do currently require photographs be submitted of the story poles once they have been installed. That is already part of the story pole policy.
So it seems, common sense tells me the most would probably be 60 days.
Depending on if there are multiple Planning Commission hearings or an appeal from Development Review Committee to Planning Commission. But yes.
Thank you.
So I guess, my question is, if you have DRC and then it gets appealed and then goes to Planning Commission, and if it's continued, it may not be heard the first time it goes to Planning Commission. And then if it gets through Planning Commission and gets appealed, we're talking 56, 66, and maybe longer if something's continued. If we did 60 days, we might still have the story poles down before it gets to council.
Correct. That is a possibility. If a project is going to Planning Commission and that decision is made that evening and then appealed to Town Council, a 60-day time frame would allow the story poles to be up by the time it gets to Town Council.
Okay. Councilmember Hudes.
Again, I would point out just from experience on the Planning Commission that sometimes people don't notice right away. And it seems as though these situations with, appeals are the very situations where you want story poles to be there because you've got more community engagement on the particular issue, unless you just want to kind of write a blank check on things. I think the story poles serve a purpose in these appeal situations, even maybe even more. I remember a number of cases on the Planning Commission like that.
I have a question. We've decided that people can opt out of story poles and do a visual rendering and a computer generated rendering in all cases. Not for not for hillside and not for historic, right?
That motion was specifically for multifamily and mixed-use projects.
Okay, so mostly what we're going to be talking about are, okay. Any other comments? Do we have a motion? Oh, we do have a motion and a second. No? No, we don't. We have nothing.
No motion yet.
Anybody want to make a motion? Do we want to just leave this the way it is? Do we have an appetite to try to change it? Okay, we have no motion. Vice Mayor?
Yeah, I would leave it as is. If we need a motion, I would say to reject the Planning Commission recommendation and maintain story poles until a decision has been made on the project and the appeal period has ended.
Okay, do I have a second? Councilmember Hudes?
I'll second.
Okay, I think Councilmember Moore.
I think we should put some sort of timeline on it. I think that I think this can really get dragged out. So I think that some sort of timeline makes sense. I think perhaps 60 days is something I would be in favor of. So I think I will not be supporting this motion.
Councilmember Rennie.
I do agree to some extent, because I know when I see these in my neighborhood, and I think other people see the same thing, this orange netting kind of looks like crap, and you know, it attracts your attention, and I find that I actually subconsciously, when it finally comes down, go, oh, so much better. I don't have to look at what looks like sort of a bad construction site that actually hasn't even started yet. And so, you know, I understand there's kind of a necessary evil for a few days, but some of these seem that stick around for months, and you walk by them or drive by them like, oh God, that still looks like crap over there. When is that going to end? So it actually bothers me when it drags out just visually. So I tend to agree we should have some limit on this, both for, you know, the more cost effective for the people that are trying to get a project done, but also I think that it just looks bad when they start falling down, and I've been there a long time, and they're half faded, and one corner's hanging down, and the poles are bending or whatever.
You make these sound so attractive. Okay, well, we have a motion and a second. I'm not sure how much support we have, but I'm going to call the question, and this motion is to reject it completely and have an unlimited time. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? No. Okay, so motion fails 2-3 with council members Rennie, Moore, and the mayor voting no. Do we have an alternative motion? Sound like you are working up to one. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. So I'll make a motion to modify the story pole ordinance to limit the length of installation to no more than 60 days after the first public hearing, or, and I think, or when they should also come down if the project has been approved, right, or denied by council.
Yeah, I was going to ask, that is the case. Or do we have a mandate when the poles come down?
Correct. We do require that they come down within 30 days of a final decision.
Okay.
So I would be fine keeping that.
Okay, but they need to stay up for up to 60 days after the first hearing.
They would stay up for up to 60 days, yeah.
Okay, do we have a second?
I'll second.
Councilmember, any seconds, comments? All right, I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay, motion passes 3-2 by a margin of 30 days, with the Vice Mayor and Councilmember Hudes voting no. All right. We are moving along here. The next is public notice. So we're looking at Planning Commission recommending the requirements to ensure public notice is provided on all projects, on-site signage for all publicly noticed projects, require QR codes and email, contact information on the signage, recommend signage earlier in the process. They weren't specific on what earlier means. and provide signage standards to ensure visually striking signs. That sounds completely objective. But, okay, so we may need to define visually striking, the timing of the installation, and other parameters. And we have a staff recommendation to consider whether story pole policy should include allowance for visual simulations and circumstances. And it sounds like okay. So, discussion on that? I want a hologram. Councilmember Moore.
Great. Question of staff, is there a standard size for large signs?
I can look back to what was required for the signage for the Winchester project. We had something that aligned with what the maximum was for construction signs, but I'd have to look that up.
Okay, great.
Unless the director has.
Yeah, through the chair. So it's basically a sheet of plywood 4x8.
Okay. Yeah. I think that would be about the mass of the sign I'd be comfortable with.
Any other comments on other parameters here?
No, I think the Planning Commission's recommendations are all good. Require on-site signage for all publicly noticed projects, require QR codes, recommend signage earlier in the process. That sounds great. And recommend signage standards. So I think 4x8 would be plenty big, and I think that's pretty similar to what we've seen. The other thing on here on item 2 that the Planning Commission recommended is require QR codes and email contact. I think those are both important and great, but I also think wherever the QR code goes, there should also be a actual link to that in case anyone isn't comfortable with the QR code. They can type in the link on their computer or phone, so then it goes to the site.
Okay. Councilmember Hudes and then Vice Mayor.
It doesn't really define the information on the sign, and so if we are moving to more use of visual renderings, then I think that some of those images should be included on the sign as well as what we require now. I assume that we require an elevation and certain aspects that go on that sign, but in this case, it would seem like it would be valuable to have some of those images on the sign as well.
Thank you for that question. Yes, the existing policy does have details about what is required, and it distinguishes between single-family residential projects versus larger projects and what needs to be on the signs in terms of visual rendering. If you take a look at starting on, looks like it's page 6 of the track changes version of the policy. That does include, and then on to 7, talks about the size of the signage for different types of projects and what needs to be included on the signs as well. Sign content. Up to 75% of the overall sign area must be used to provide general description of the project, including number of residential units or commercial buildings and square footage, a color perspective drawing, 3-dimensional image or photographic simulation, and the name and contact information of the project applicant. Single-family remodel projects are not required to provide rendering on the sign. Public notice portion of the sign message must contain constitute 25% of the overall sign area and notify the community of the public hearing date and time and contain, it's got specific wording to be included.
Councilmember Hudes.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I remember from looking at these, but the question is where we are using visual renderings to substitute for story poles, showing hillside and some of the other things we discussed. Are they contained in that content now, or do we need to add to that?
So the current requirement does include a color perspective drawing, three-dimensional image, or photographic simulation to be included on the sign, with the exception of the single-family remodel projects.
So would that cover things like the perspective of hillside views and the perspective of nearby buildings that would be contained in a visual rendering?
At this time, it just specifies the one image. It does not give details as to what should be included in that image. And depending on the size of the sign, it may be difficult to meet all of those criteria with multiple perspectives being needed.
Director Paulson looks like he wants to add some information.
Yeah, I think that the one thing that would need to be covered, and thank you to Ms. Armour for the clarification I was speaking about, or the multifamily and the mixed-use projects where they get the larger signs like the commercial, but those aren't accommodated in this, so we probably need to add those categories for the signage. For the commercial, industrial remodels or new construction, we can make sure it's captured there.
Yeah, and the concern I'm raising is for those folks who don't access things on a smartphone or easily get to a computer and remember the link when they get home. So, and this is for, a significant part of our population that walks and discovers things by walking around. And so enhancing the sign content for those with content from these renderings that we are now allowing to substitute, I think would be beneficial for our residents.
I think that's a good point. I'm concerned that if we put too many things on a sign, it won't be readable. I mean, then all of a sudden you've got lots of little small pictures on there as well. But I think we're trying to accomplish a lot of things, and that's helpful. I also don't know a lot of people that don't have a smartphone, and I don't want to discriminate against people who don't. I think we need some information there, but I think a lot of, you're right. If somebody walks by and sees it and they don't have their phone with them, or they can't remember the email address, maybe they would say, hey, something's happening, and come back and take a picture of it later. I think we can't solve all problems at once, but I think it's worth weighing how much information we put on the board versus whether you can actually read what's on there. Councilmember Moore, did you have, no, Vice Mayor, sorry.
Yeah, so I was looking at number 3, and it says recommend signage early in the process. Well, what does that mean? If you could elaborate on that, because how do you define early in the process? And recommend, I didn't take the recommendation, so what?
Thank you for that question. And yes, that is one of the points that staff is looking for direction from Town Council. At this time, we require the signage and or story poles to be installed prior to public notice being sent out of a pending decision or public hearing. And so this was a discussion without specific direction from Planning Commission that it occur sooner in the process. One of the concerns with it occurring too early in the process is there are times when the design of the building and therefore the image on the sign could change through the staff technical review process. And so it could then be different by the time it is getting to a public hearing.
Thank you.
And just for consideration, there are some jurisdictions that require the on-site signs after the first 30 days of an application being submitted. So it's very early in the process, and it typically has some basic information, but not typically a rendering. So some organizations really do use the on-site signs as the earliest notification that something is happening. But you can always switch out. It's expensive. There is an expense to replacing the rendering, but it is possible. So it's just another data point for consideration.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Sorry. A follow-on question to that then. So in municipalities where they do have, kind of an early sign, almost something's coming or we're doing something. I think that's helpful. Do most of them then require renderings of the project when it's available?
Yeah, especially the big projects. There's going to be a color rendering typically on the on-site sign early on. And even if it does change through the design review process, at least there's some representation of the massing and the height of the building on the on-site sign.
And then if I can ask one more question. So in the instance that somebody did that, and I'm just asking for your recommendation, so if there is a rendering of the building and then there's changes made, would the QR code, could like a sticker be put on there? Some changes have been made, see the website for latest, or would we require, or do some places require an updated rendering?
No, what they typically do is to advise to check the website for the most current plans. So they do expect the person who's walking by to, jot down the project name, the project file number, the planner, the project planner, and then check back in to make sure that they're looking at the most current plans.
Okay. I can see that being really helpful, that people get early notice that something's coming before they know. The other thing I'm thinking about as you're talking through this is there are times where a project maybe is appealed to the plan or goes to the planning commission, and then there are changes made in that meeting and it's approved. And so what is approved is not what the story polls show or is not what the renderings are. So it would not be that unusual that as a project goes forward, it wouldn't exactly match the picture on there. And, just with large letters, letting people know to look at an update. Yeah, that happens already. Okay, that's helpful. Any comments about this, Councilmember Hudes?
I just wanted to come back to the Vice Mayor's question about earlier in the process and whether staff has a recommendation if we were to move it earlier, what might trigger that.
Thank you for that question. I would say that the example that the town manager provided as being installed 30 days after initial submittal would be one option. As previously stated, right now the requirement is that it be installed prior to public notice of the public hearing. I think you could set it at any time in between.
Okay, Vice Mayor.
So I actually like the recommendation by staff. Not everyone knows to look at pending projects on the town website. So for me, I would like to make that a requirement for the town manager and Ms. Armour's, I don't know if it's your recommendation, but a suggestion.
Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that's a good suggestion too. I'm just a little bit worried about what that ends up creating in terms of consequences, because the other thing we're asking for is for them to be very representative, and it sounds like that's not what will be on these signs then. Yeah, I think that's just a thought. I think that they will be, the earlier we do it, right, the less representative they will probably be. So I don't know. I think how we currently have it before public noticing also makes sense. Yeah, I don't know. Just a decision.
That's a good point. Councilmember Hudes.
Yeah, I understand the point that they could change, but again, having looked at hundreds of projects, it's a small percentage that change dramatically, and so I think the benefit of seeing it earlier, as the Planning Commission suggests, is outweighed by the potential wrong information that would come from the process, because it just most of them don't change all that much.
Vice Mayor.
So another reason why I like that idea is that it allows residents to get engaged early on, because you don't always have good communication between a developer and a resident. So this encourages the neighbors to get involved and maybe be part of the process, especially in the event of a developer that doesn't engage the residents and make for a project that fits into the community.
I think the other thing is our noticing radius is specified by state law, and people will be walking by a project or see it and they might be outside that radius. Ms. Armour?
Thank you. Through the mayor, just one additional suggestion to consider, that maybe the signage be required after the first round of staff technical review, so that there is the opportunity for the applicant to address an initial set of comments from staff that could result in significant changes to the proposed building prior to putting together a design for the sign.
That sounds like an excellent suggestion. And so that would, typically when that would come out, then how long would it be until a hearing, either at DRC or Planning Commission? And noticing.
It can vary significantly. In some cases, once we've provided one set of comments, then there are minor changes and they're good to go. In other cases, it can be months before they have fully addressed staff comments. I don't know if the director has anything to add.
Thank you. No, I think it's highly variable depending on a number of factors, so that would be a little bit challenging, but we're definitely here to hear what direction council's interested in going.
So what it sounds like to me is that if we required the sign to go up after it goes through the first round of technical review, there still could be some substantial changes, but it's better than doing it the minute they put the application in, because it might be more responsive. And then should we have some type of standard for when or if or how the sign gets updated? So if it's small tweaks from what the image is one thing, but if all of a sudden they say, you know what, we're going to do 3 buildings instead of 1 or something like that, like what would a recommendation be to trigger an update on it as it's moving through the process?
That would be difficult to set an objective standard, but the town manager may have some thoughts.
Yeah, it really depends what the purpose of the sign is. So in other jurisdictions, the purpose of the sign is simply notification. Something is happening at this location. Who's the developer? Who's the project planner? How do I get more information? What's the project file number, et cetera. So it's really about notification. And then if someone's really interested, they'll go and look at the plans, they'll come into the office, they'll talk to the planner, they'll go online, et cetera. So it's really about notification. If instead we're saying, no, we really want the sign to describe the project, then I think the sign probably isn't the best mechanism to describe a project. But maybe it can be supplemented with some of these other tools that you've been discussing this evening.
Okay, thank you. Because I think we've been talking about, substituting story poles with signs.
Right, but now we're talking about
this is
signs for all projects. So what you could do is define the requirements for all signs, since now all public, if council moves forward with item E, it would require signs on everything that has a public hearing. However, you might say, well, for these large projects, mixed use, multifamily, taller than 55 feet, where you're going to use the 4x8 sign, that you might have different specifications or additional specifications. So I think first we need to figure out, what do you want on every sign, and then what do you want on the bigger project or the more in-depth projects?
Thank you for that clarification, because I think what we're talking about, maybe for me, I need to focus on what is the notification sign that would happen everywhere. And then if we're talking about replacing story poles on certain projects, what does that big sign look like? And that might be a separate sign or a second sign, a sign that comes up when the project is ready, not an either or. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think what we've been talking about probably sounds good after the first round of reviews for all signs. I think that makes sense to me. And so to answer these to get to the Planning Commission's recommendations, require on-site signage. It sounds like we're all there. QR code and contact information plus the link. Sounds like we're there. Earlier in the process, when we're describing that as after the first round of staff review, and then more visually striking. It sounds like for this, perhaps we just leave them as is, and then we do the more visually striking, because we don't want a 4x8. I don't want a 4x8 sign for a residential project, right? Like a small single-family home. So I would leave that as is, and then move on to the more visually striking for the big noticing signs.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you. So for a question for staff, Ms. Armour, when we talked about, after the first round of technical review, does that mean the same thing as staff review as Council Moore had recommended?
Yes, that is correct. Staff technical review.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure that both words are coupled together, because staff review might be something that's not a technical review.
Staff
I don't know. I
technical
don't do
review.
your job, but I just want to make sure that we're, very exact on what we're talking about.
Okay, sounds good. So it sounds like we have the start of a motion. I don't know how we define, and then the vibrant. Councilmember Hughes.
I don't know whether this is currently available, but if we're moving to QR codes and email contact, that we also let people know that they can view the project at the library or wherever we think is the best place for them to do that.
The current requirement does include reference to additional information available at Town Hall.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, then I can make that motion.
Yeah.
So I'll make a motion to, actually, I guess the only change we're making here is to require QR codes, email contact, and link to the project on signage, and ask and also require that signage be posted within 30 days of initial staff technical review of a pending application.
Okay, we have a motion. I'll second it for the sake. Oh, I'm sorry, Manager.
I just want to clarify that we're talking about public notice signs for all projects that that are publicly noticed.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, so we have that motion. I'll second it. Discussion? Awfully quiet. Okay, then I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
No one opposed. Motion passes 5-0. And then we'll move to F, the exception process. So, and we kind of touched on exceptions before, I think, but not maybe at this depth. Councilmember Hughes.
Yeah, my sense on this is that we're going to have far fewer exceptions with the process, with the streamlining that we've done, and that we have been able to handle the exceptions by council with the ones so far, and it will only get better with the streamlining. So I think that town council should review the exceptions as currently.
I have a question. What is the cost to an applicant if they have to come to council for an exception versus, do we charge them for that or not? Okay. All right, that's good to know. So this is not a financial impediment. It either goes to the council or goes to staff, and that is the same cost?
There's
Director Paulson?
There's not an actual fee, but obviously there's time involved, so they often equate time to money.
Good point. Any other comments on this or thoughts? Councilmember Moore.
I agree with what Councilmember Hughes said. I think that's fine generally, especially if, maybe the exceptions are going to be more rare moving forward. I do think, though, that this is a good time to talk about what we want to do for projects that have currently been proposed, especially because in my head, most of them qualified. if they were proposed today, they would not require story poles, and they would require visual renderings. And so I'm curious if this, again, want to make sure that we're not doing anything where we're messing with, requiring anything of applicants above and beyond what is appropriate. But I think it would make sense to retroactively apply the changes we just made.
Are you thinking specifically of the SB 330 projects?
Perhaps it could be a pending project in the last year, so we're not so specific.
So, thinking about this at the meeting, tonight, I think only the SB 330 projects will have the issue of having vested to existing policies. And so the vesting will only come into play with an SB 330 project or someone who's filed a vesting tentative map. And I can't think of anybody who has a vesting tentative map. And so I think it's really only the SB 330 projects that would be subject to the policy that was in place at the date their application was deemed submitted.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
My thought is I don't really have an appetite for that. I think if they want an exception, they can ask us. With an SB 330, they've vested to a variety of things, some of which we would prefer to be able to update, and we can't. And so if they want a different story pole policy, they always have the option to ask for an exception. But if they're vesting to the old story policy, they're also vesting to older traffic impact fees and other things. So I'd rather not go backward and start giving exceptions on how someone chose to vest. Councilmember Moore?
Part of my other thought here is that I would like to see accurate visual renderings from those applicants, and perhaps from a legal perspective, that's not something we can ask of them. I don't know if we're technically lowering the constraint, if we can change what we're asking of them, and maybe this is more complicated than we need to talk about tonight. But I'm just thinking we're gonna end up there's not going to be story poles for any of these. I don't think, right? I think they're pretty tall. And I'd like to see visual renderings out of them, but I mean, we can just do that on a case-by-case basis. I think that's fine.
Councilmember Hudes.
Yeah, I'm not so clear reviewing them in my head, whether they all have that same height requirement, and whether they all meet the 20% and other things until they move along further in the process. So, I think there's a handful of them. I think they could be handled through the exception process. And I am sympathetic to the point that the mayor has made about keeping consistency with what they vest in and not doing carve-outs for certain things, and it makes sense to me that if they vested, then they vested.
Any other comments? Councilmember Moore.
I think that's totally fine. I appreciate all that. Perhaps staff can just, make sure the applicants are aware of the changes that have been made and what they might be asked if they come in front of us for an exemption, that they're probably going to be asked for these visual renderings and some of the changes, et cetera.
Okay. Yes. So is there any action we need to take on this? It sounds like we're not making that exception.
So what I heard is an interest in keeping the exception process as it currently is, rather than accepting the Planning Commission recommendation. It would be useful to have a motion to that effect.
Okay, Vice Mayor.
So I move to reject the Planning Commission recommendation and maintain the existing process, which requires Town Council review for exceptions.
I'll second it. I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
No one opposed. Motion passes 5-0. Now the question is, do we want to have the larger conversation about story polls, or do we feel like with all the work we've done, we're done? We're done? But Councilmember Moore.
So I'll just clarify. So it sounds like so now where we're requiring story polls is exclusively in these 4 categories of residential projects, non-residential projects, projects in the historic resource inventory, and properties in the hillside area. Is that accurate?
I'm going to need to go and take all of your motions from tonight
Yeah.
and put it into.
Right. It's in here. Residential is defined as single family or duplex projects. So the one that the only one I would be interested in discussing is the non-residential projects. I think it's a little strange that we're requiring them for all non-residential, but again, if there's not the appetite for that discussion tonight, totally fine. Not a huge deal.
Council, if I may.
Yes.
We've had a lot of really good input and motions from all of you this evening, as well as the discussion that we had in August. I think staff needs some time to compile all of this into a coherent policy. So this is going to have to come back for consideration one more time. So that way you can really see it in its entirety. And then, we can make additional tweaks if necessary, but I don't know if staff's ready to finalize tonight.
I think that's fine. It sounds like there is interest, at least from one council member, in seeing it, but I think we also can take the motions that have been provided and pull those together into an updated policy.
Right. I would say for me, I've got confused enough as you pull it apart and we look at each thing, then putting it back together takes a little thought. I'll go to Councilmember Rennie and then Councilmember Hudes.
And I would just go back to kind of where we started. I think we've made some pretty good progress on removing constraints. So I would be, we started asking, let's have a conversation with the HCD reviewer, because we only had five sections, and one of them was, I think, was this a whole section or part of a section? Anyway, this was a big piece of one of the sections, and so I'd be curious to see, for whatever it's worth. I know they'll change their mind when they write it up, but if they say, no, you need to do more work, then we definitely know we need to do more work. If they say, well, it looks pretty good, then maybe we only have to do more work. So I would like to see us have a conversation with them on the progress we've made.
Councilmember Hudes.
I was just going to say that I think it's important that we capture this well enough that we can discuss these ideas with HCD at the very next meeting, because in reading the letter, this was one, but I counted 5 other major issues that need to be addressed, and I think to take this one off the table would be really helpful so that we can move forward on the others.
Okay, Councilmember Moore.
And just to triple down on that, I think, because there were a lot of pieces of this, I think specifically highlighting that we removed the story poll requirement in its entirety for multifamily and mixed use is, I think, a big step. And so I think something that's worth highlighting.
All right. It's Vice Mayor. Oh, and wait, the town clerk has.
I just wanted to clarify if the policy was being revised, because it does require an adoption of a resolution.
So I guess the question for me is whether town council would like to see the fully revised policy, or is comfortable with the motions as modifications to the ordinance that was provided with the staff report.
It sounded, Director Paulson.
Yeah, I would just offer that, as the town manager mentioned, it's probably given so many changes from 2 different meetings. Inevitably, we're going to find things that are going to be in conflict throughout the document. So I think it's best to bring it back, and at that time, we'll adopt the resolution.
I agree with that. Councilmember Hudes, you had your hand up for a second.
I was just going to agree, as long as we're able to move the conversation forward with HCD.
Absolutely. We will message to HCD that we have motions from the town council to make these changes, and that'll be part of our discussion next week.
Thank you.
Perfect. Vice Mayor?
So at this point, do you need a final motion, or is that enough information? Because there's alternatives on page 4 of the staff report.
I think we've gotten sufficient direction for modifications to be made and bring back a revised ordinance and revised policy for consideration by town council, unless there are any other topics that the council would like to discuss or give direction on.
Any other topics?
And if it's simple enough, when we do put all of the changes together and bring back the resolution, if it is clear, this could potentially be a consent item for consideration. We don't necessarily need to rehash anything unless we have substantive feedback, either from HCD or we find an internal conflict that needs to be resolved.
Right. I think that sounds perfect. I think, talking about there could be conflict. If there's not, if it's all smooth and it's everything we said and it flows together and we don't get comments from HCD to do more, then it'll be up to the next mayor. But I think that could be a consent item because we were ready to make the motion on it tonight. But I think it's in the best interest of everybody to make sure this all comes together. Any other comments on this? All right. Well, I appreciate the work of staff putting all these pieces together. I also appreciate the work of my fellow council members working through this. And for this term, for this year, it'll be the last time I adjourn a meeting. So meeting adjourned.